Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Savior King, the Master Tactician and the Queen of Liberation in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 76. The shock wave from the two fail-not arrows crashing into each other threw Byleth off her feet. Ironically, this proved to be something of a blessing in disguise, because when she blinked and looked up at the ceiling, she saw a massive dark cloud forming beneath the ceiling directly overhead. Bolting! She shouted in warning, rolling onto one knee and hurtling herself forward with the ease of long practice. Rhea and Seath immediately grabbed the people closest to them, Atra and Ingrid and Lysithea, respectively, bodily threw them out of the way, and ran for the walls. Not a second too soon, as a massive bolt of lightning cracked down from the sky and struck the ground they had been standing firm. Even jumping back as she didn't quite get Byleth out of the blast zone. The heat choked her and her muscles momentarily locked up as static danced over her skin. A trembling shiver racked her. She reached into Sutheza's heart and gave herself a single firm shake, twisting her head as she looked around for where the mage who'd cast might be standing. Unfortunately, the wide hallway they were standing in was full of mages, war masters, and heroes all charging toward them, making finding any one individual something of a pointless exercise. It didn't help that seconds after the bolting had landed, a meteor spell was forming overhead. Everyone keep one eye on the ceiling. Meteor! She warned, pointing a hand and casting thunder at one of the war masters charging at her. The man was quite stocky, but unfortunately for him he was wearing steel gauntlets. The spell hit home and crackled through his entire body, dropping him to the ground. Verdammt! Atra cussed, swinging her flame sword upward and blocking an attack with her silver blade. I thought we finished with these damn siege mages out in Inbear proper. The blast of fire flew across the room and struck a mage, causing the woman to double over. Marianne cocked her head to the side and snapped her fingers. Green light flared around her hand, and said woman broke off mid-gasp with a muted gasp as her magic was sealed. Get out of our way. She lunged forward, bringing her blades down hard one after another onto a dark mage, likely another Agar than one bolting among all these meteors. Glenn asked, jumping to the side to avoid a Thoron aimed at him. I think that's not one of Vestra's. Another Thoron was fired at him, but this time he swung the sword of Merulta and split the attack down the middle, dispersing it. Why was there a silver sacred weapon, one of McCull's finest works, crafted with the Freydarius crest? What prompted him to do that, when he hated the elites with a burning justified passion? Indek whistled and fired the inexhaustible. Several silver arrows flew from the sacred bow, striking down the heroes rushing Lysithea and Marianne in one smooth motion. Seconds later, another immense crash rang out from the central hall that threatened to knock Byleth off her feet again. She swung the sword of the Creator, gutting a war master standing guard in front of where Yuri suspected the hidden doors were, and spun back around to where her prince and king were in the fight of their lives. The golden light was still fading as Claude and Ranrigan circled each other, occasionally taking shots at each other while making moves toward rubble piles and stairwells that would give them a few feet of elevation over their opponents. Dimitri was just at the edge of this dance, alternating between cutting down anyone who attempted to take advantage of Claude's distraction and trying to find an opening in Ren's defenses he could exploit, while dodging the retaliatory arrows that Ren fired at him whenever he seemed to be edging close. Byleth tried to swallow around the brick in her throat as one of those golden-orange arrows whipped past her king's arm by mere inches. She made an abortive move toward them before another crackle of ozone caused her to almost jump out of her skin. Move! She warned, scrambling to get out of the way once again. This time the bolting and meteor were so close together they practically fell upon them at the same time. They covered almost half of the hallway, Lysithea screaming as the splash of flames seared her skin. She might have heard Glenn let out a pained curse as well, but it was hard to tell throughout the pandemonium. The ballistic is about to fire. Indek warned, sweeping Lysithea up as Marianne healed her and began running to another vantage point. Byleth cursed as she righted herself, twisting her head to search for any sign of the fake wall where the DEM control system was hiding. The strangely smooth sound of metal grinding against metal echoed from the ceiling above them. Parts of the elegantly painted marble slid upward and backward, vanishing into darkness to reveal a long metal spiral cone pointing down toward them. The opening promptly began glowing an ominous orange. Atra, rather than move back, darted forward, much to Glenn's alarm and frustration. Skidding to a stop right underneath the ballistic, She pointed the flame sword upward and cast from it just as the magic projectile was released. The two blasts struck each other head-on roughly 5 feet from the mechanism. The blowback melted part of the spiral cone, but not all of it, and sprayed embers across the floor. A few of them landed on the rug that several Imperial soldiers were standing on, setting it alight. They collectively stumbled away from it and directly into seats. The bishop, her older brother, the thought felt odd, yet right in her mind, immediately became a blur of silver, the spear of Assel shattering swords and carving through armor as if they were made of no more than parchment. Despite the fact there was 7 of them and 1 of him, he smoothly moved around their scrambled retaliatory attacks and knocked them down one by one. The spear having been carved to be a horse killer primarily, it left ugly wounds that required very quick treatment for one to survive. "You call that a plan?" Glenn complained exasperatedly as he shot to Atra's side. She was locked in combat with a hero until he moved past her and slashed clean through the man's leg armor, dropping him to one knee. Atra didn't miss a beat before kicking the hero in the face, causing him to collapse like a puppet with cut strings. "What the hell am I going to do with you? I'm going to regret letting Felix and Dimitri out of my sight, just you wait." He paused and cursed. "Ingrid, Meteor." The blonde threw herself to the side, rolled, came up on one knee and threw a short spear across the room. One of the mages who had been backing up, waving for someone to lift the silence spell that had been cast on her, took the blade to the chest and dropped dead. "Thank you," she responded, smiling brightly at him. Glenn glanced at Atra, making sure she was all right, then darted forward to join her closer to the end of the hall. Byleth hadn't been idle while this was happening. She had fallen back when she noticed Marianne and Lysithea were exposed to a number of war masters that were heading toward them from the entrance hall. Men that hadn't been there the last time she looked, too. Had the men below the floor managed to clear enough of the rubble at the stairwell to get reinforcements through? Balthus, Hilda or Constance would have to do something about that. She had her hands full. "Allow me to demonstrate." The sword of the Creator, Suthisa's bones. Which of Suthisa's bones had she been treating as a weapon this entire time? Did she even want to know? Flew out and slashed through chest armor and bare shoulders, spraying her with blood as the men stumbled to a stop. "You're in our way!" Lysithea shouted in frustration, casting miasma at one of the men. The impact sent one of the men flying into a wall, which was a truly mind-boggling demonstration of how powerful the small white-haired girl was. Did that have anything to do with the 2 crests she somehow had? "Where is that Suthi's damned false door?" Marianne pointed ahead and murmured the silence incantation again. Byleth saw a flurry of movement in the dark area just beyond the door at the end of the hallway and grinned slightly. That relief was promptly undercut when another bolting cloud formed over their heads. She didn't have to issue a verbal warning this time. Rhea was at her side in an instant, herding Lysithea forward while Byleth grabbed Marianne's wrist and pulled her along. However, once again they only escaped the blast zone by the narrowest of margins despite what experience had long taught her. The impact caused Byleth to jerk forward and nearly land flat on her face. Only Rhea/Seriosa's hand grabbing and steadying her prevented it. She could feel static crackling across the older woman's skin, and she twisted her head to check on her. Suthisa's daughter winced and smiled reassuringly despite how singled the edges of her hair were and the fact that she was slapping out a flame that had begun to burn on her cape. "I'm all right," she said reassuringly. "Be careful," Byleth told her worriedly. "I swear, she's as bad as you," Suthis grumbled, sounding for all the world as if she was somewhere between exasperation and an odd sort of pride. Says the girl who completely exhausted herself to the point of being helpless in order to save the world and the human race, Byleth responded good-naturedly. "You no longer get to tease me for being dramatic. The absolute blazing flames I don't." Suthis protested indigently. "That was the only reasonable choice I could make, while you, meanwhile, will stick your head in an active volcano if you thought doing so would make your people's lives slightly more comfortable." "Meteor ahead." "Yeah, I see it." "Ugh, I agree with Atra. I thought we were done with the Vestra magic core." Rushing back to the entrance, Byleth stumbled as another building-racking explosion signaled the continuation of Claude's duel with Ren. Risking a quick look into the increasingly wrecked entrance hall, seriously, several of the pillars had gaping holes in them from the arrows, part of the left balcony had collapsed, and several rugs and paintings were on fire as Claude dodged past another blast from Ren, who wasn't any slower than when she'd last seen him. Dmitri was scrambling from behind one of the still intact pillars, a splash of blood visible on the shining silver of his shoulder armor. That was a bucket of ice water over the frustrated confusion buzzing through her mind. These bloody bone weapons are going to be the death of me. Now where is that damned ballistic so I can go help them before they bring the ceiling down on us? Excellent question. Unfortunately, you're asking the wrong person, Suthi's deadpanned. Have you thought to ask Yuri? Yuri, I really hope you're as close as you said you were. Atra yelled seemingly into the air as she scrambled backwards to avoid the meteor spell bearing down on her. Marianne charged forward several steps and fired Thoron up at the falling projectile, shattering it into dozens of pieces that Indek promptly disposed of with the inexhaustible. Pausing and turning on her heel, Atra blocked both the heroes who had converged on her and dropped to one knee, deflecting one sword and avoiding the second so it would cut into the stomach of her second opponent. Lysithea promptly nailed the first hero in the back with Swarm as he stared in shock at his handiwork. For every step we take forward we're taking 5 back. Yuri might have said something in response. Byleth couldn't see him, since he was under the crest of Aubyn's invisibility spell, but it was promptly undercut by a series of bone-rattling roars from the main hallway. Quickly she blasted the Agarthan mage that had jumped out of a rubble pile to attack her into ash with aura and turned around, terrified more of those gigantic beasts had suddenly been unleashed. Only to be greeted with the sight of Ren von Regan scrambling down from the high ground he'd claimed to avoid the snapping jaws of the wolf beast that had suddenly materialized in the room. Another wolf bounded right past Claude, ignoring him in favor of the Einherjar who quickly brought up Failnaught and shot it through the mouth, instantly shattering its magical barrier. Then a third rushed at him, only to meet a similar fate. Wait, no, they weren't attacking Ren specifically. They had initially been trying to get at something behind him, or rather, someone. Someone who promptly cast Banshee at the Einherjar's unguarded back and made for the entrance of the hall she was currently standing with all her might. Byleth hurriedly stepped out into the hall and took aim at the third wolf, who forgot the staggering, and possibly cursing, going by his body language, master sniper in favor of charging down its initial prey. Fucking cheating asshole, having his own damn relic. Happy yelled as she hurtled past Byleth into relative safety. Her professor immediately lashed the creator's sword out and sliced into the wolf's head to shatter its skull, killing it. As it crumbled into dust, she watched Ren blast the second wolf that had been bearing down on him into dust and struggle through Banshee's draining effect to bring Failnaught up in time to block Dmitri and Eridbar. Nicely done, Byleth gasped as she saw Eridbar slice Ren's shoulder as the ancient Regan moved his arm under Dmitri's enhanced strength. She nearly had a stroke when, despite staggering in clear pain and having to duck in order to avoid an arrow from Claude, Ren still brought his bow up and nearly shot Dmitri point blank. She started to rush to help them only for Happy to grab her shoulder. Chatterbox, you're in someone's crosshairs. The redhead warned her. Byleth glanced up and let out a long string of Dagia obscenities to see yet another bolting cold forming over her head. They must be further back, seeing you through some of the windows. Suthies said urgently as the two of them flew back into the hallway just in time to avoid the bolting that almost blinded her with its sheer power and intensity. Her muscles nearly locked up on her for a moment as the wave of electricity from the impact washed over her. They must be standing behind the meteor mages and beyond the ballistic, and they're targeting you specifically. I wasn't sure until just now, but I'm certain of it. Damn it. Yuri, where are you? Byleth hissed through gritted teeth as she took stock of the hallway again. Rhea/Sirios was slashing a hero's sword apart before kicking a warrior's knee out of joint with a wince-inducing crack while Indek was shooting at the ballistic, which had appeared in the ceiling again with a fresh new barrel. Atra and Glenn were forcing their way toward the meteor mages at the back while Lysithea and Marianne pummeled the war masters trying to get into the hallway into submission. They had some help from Ash while he managed the main hall, judging by how some of the bodies simply dropped to the ground with arrows stuck in their back while the two mages were taking aim at them. She didn't take more than 2 steps down the hall. They had to take care of that damn ballistic. It was a miracle they hadn't been able to target Dmitri and Claude yet. When suddenly a fraction of the wall roughly 4 to 5 yards away from the far door collapsed inward, revealing an internal room. Seconds later, there was a sharp scream from within and the sound of liquid splattering against stone, and the faint sound of metal grinding that had been grating on her ears since their entrance came to a stop. Never doubt Yuri Bird, Chatterbox, Happy said slightly chidingly, though she smiled in visible relief when Yuri melted out of the room, waving mock innocently at the still silenced meteor mages at the end of the hall. Thank you. Atra yelled at her friend before launching herself at the few remaining heroes, keeping them apart from the meteor mages and the door that was blocking off one of the entrances to the throne room, and, likely, the asshole who was still somehow casting bolting at her. How in the blazing flames does this jackass still have enough magic to be casting that? Lysithea exploded when yet another ominous cloud formed above their heads. This time, Byleth swore, spun on her heel and swung the sword of the Creator straight upward, channeling magic throughout the blades as they pierced into the black fog above. Only Constance can use siege magic more than 6 times in one battle without killing herself, and that's because she has the CRE, she has Seleni's blood. What the fuck is this asshat's excuse? I don't know, but I don't think we're gonna, shit heads up. Yuri's comment broke off into cursing when the cloud, Komusted from the Creator sword's magic. The attempt to stop the spell did not have the effect Byleth expected. Instead of being dispersed, the lightning discharged in all directions, crashing into the walls and the floor and narrowly missing several of their own soldiers. Letting out another string of invectives that would have made an Almiran blush, Byleth shouted an apology and bolted headlong toward the door, silently begging Claude and Dimitri to hold out without her for a little while longer. I can't be of any help to them until I deal with this person. Glenn righted himself while casually blocking a hero's strike without looking at him. Surrender for me, will you? He asked exasperatedly before kicking the man's shin, causing the soldier to double over and giving him an opening to slam the sword of Meralta's hilt into his face, dropping him. That's almost all of them, they've gotta be on the other side of that door. He called out. Stay behind me, Marianne, Byleth said urgently, running past the still silenced mages who were scrambling to plaster themselves against the walls, trembling with terror. One of them seemed to be pulling out a Levin sword only for Raphael to pop out from underneath Yuri's invisibility spell to slug her in the face, cracking her cheekbones and sending her crumbling to the floor. I know, Professor. Hey, wait up. Happy protested, before swearing and spinning around to cast death at some poor unfortunate soul. Back off, asshat. I'm with Balthus, where the hell are you people still coming from at this point? Look at the skin, I think they're Agar than. Lysithea shouted, followed by the sound of swarm descending on another opponent. You shouldn't have left Shamhala, fools. Help them secure this hallway, then move on to another objective. Byleth ordered. Yuri didn't look particularly happy, but nodded in agreement. There was an enormous crash and a crackle of thunder coming from the main hall. She was frightened for a moment, but a roaring cheer from voices she recognized proved the source was Constance, not her current assassin. But Byleth Seath protested, clearly making to go after her. Go help Claude and Dimitri. She shouted over her shoulder. She was really happy to hear him using her first name, but this wasn't really the time. Without waiting to see if he'd agree, she knew without seeing that Indek would hesitate, hover in frustrated conflict for a moment, before ducking out to lend her 2 boys the backup they sorely needed. Byleth hit the door with a high-powered bolganone that burnt through the treated wood like it was so much tri-tinder and burst into the darkened black room where Suthies suspected her would-be sniper was hiding. The room was fairly dark. There were only 2 torches in the wide empty room and no windows to the outside, just internal ones. It was a little hard to see it even with light flooding in from the doorway she'd just pulverized, but the stairwell at the back of the room was visible, if still shadowed. There were many places Imperial soldiers and servants alike could use to slip into the maze-like basement of the castle. It was one of the defensive features meant to buy time. There was some thumping and the faint sound of people running coming up from within the stairwell, but Byleth wasn't entirely sure if it was actually coming from that direction or just echoing the general chaos of the palace. How many more reinforcements could there be? After Inbear fell, the army splintered due to Edelgard's choices, and the people had turned their cloaks. Of course, that question was completely at the back of her mind. Her eyes weren't drawn to the stairwell, that wasn't what had grabbed and held her attention. Standing in the center of the room, alone and not visibly perturbed in the slightest at the sudden intrusion into her hiding place, was a deathly pale woman in gramarye robes. She tilted her head slightly when Byleth came in, but otherwise stood unnaturally still and stiff. And several feet beyond her, crumbled on the floor, was the badly burnt and unmoving form of Casper. Byleth felt nausea, horror, and fury well up in her and seal her throat with their sheer intensity. Without sparing a word, she pointed at Casper and swung the sword of the Creator directly at the woman's face. She jumped out of the way, then retaliated with a supercharged Abraxas. Byleth dropped to the ground to avoid it and heard the ear-splitting sound of stone shattering and wood splintering into nothing. When she got up, more daylight was pouring into the room around them. That Gremory had, with a single shot, blown a hole right through the palace wall. A green aura quickly sounded her, forming the familiar bands of silence. Byleth heard a terribly familiar rusty-sounding voice spit out a half-formed curse of alarm escape the Gremory's throat as she stumbled backwards. Then she pressed her hands outward, a silvery white haze surrounding her and pressing back against the bonds of silence. To her mingled horror and disbelief, Byleth watched as that haze briefly formed the symbol of Angharad's crest stone, the crest of Lamine, before the magic bonds that had disabled so many of her fellow siege mages dissipated. Another one, she said in fury and disbelief, choking under the wave of grief and fury from Suthies that nearly blacked out her vision. Raphael, look out! I know! He yelled, grabbing a hand axe from his belt and flinging it at the now identified Lamine. She fired back with what looked like Seraphim. Of all spells, she of all people knew Faith Magic Dash, which incinerated the weapon. Marianne, what's going on? He's not dead, Marianne gasped, her hand pressing gently against Casper's throat. His body shivered, but he didn't react any further. He's not dead but he is dying. He found me, Lamine rasped, one hand raised toward Byleth again. The young queen swore bitterly and swung the sword of the Creator forward. The blade crashed into Abraxas, dividing the blast before her and causing it to slam through the walls behind her, creating new holes. How many of those can we afford before the ceiling integrity drops below what's acceptable? She swung the blade again, but Lamine was surprisingly quick on her feet, dodging again. Punched out MMYYH Andler. W was quite funny, B but D doing SSOM marked him an enemy. C can't E escape the C ompu NCTON, and not E even to H heal. A dark scowl fell upon her unsettling face at that, orange-red eyes flashing with loathing. Get him out of here, you two. Rhea ordered fiercely, diving to Byleth's side and bringing the sword of Sirios to bear. Atra appeared in the doorway seconds later, went ghostly pale, and turned to yell something at the others. We'll attend to her. Lamine blinked a few times at her arrival, then she dipped her head in some muted gesture of respect. Rhea moved to charge at him as Raphael swung Casper up in his arms. Byleth saw him coming just a second too late. Rhea! She cried out, trying to pull her back, but she was just a few seconds too late. Sirios saw him coming at the last second and shifted enough that Mirror Eridbar didn't cut through her chest, but instead the blade slammed through her shoulder and impaled her on its length. Where did he come from? Suthies raged as Byleth activated Divine Pulse, causing time to grind to a halt as she prepared to reverse it. How many of those 10 are here? Byleth watched the form of Michael Bladed retreat backward until she realized what had happened. For such a large man, he was deceptively light on his feet. He'd emerged from the stairs and crossed the room in an instant, and neither Marianne nor Raphael had seen him coming because they'd been wholly focused on the dying Casper. I don't know, Byleth admitted. If she'd had a human heart, it would have been racing so quickly she'd be in genuine danger of an attack. 2 of them in the same room, this is a nightmare. A thought occurred to her and she kicked herself in furious panic. If they're here, and Ren's in the hall, then where in the 7th hell is Frildarius? Most likely in the other hallway with the 2nd ballistic. Damn it. She might have already killed some of the strike team and I wouldn't know until I got over there. Byleth thought in a panic, looking back toward the door. That team has relic users amongst them, and Flane is nearby. They are not helpless, Byleth, don't panic. They've never fought anyone like her before. You cannot be everywhere at once. There are more elites to come. If our army is to stand a chance against them, some of your students have to be ready to fight them. Suthies said, grabbing her arm before she could turn back time all the way to the beginning of the battle. She'd started to do that, her thoughts a blur. I don't like it any more than you do, but we have to trust them. Byleth swallowed hard, trying to think through the panic in her mind. Terrible images were running through her mind. memories of the deaths of her friends which she had previously averted through divine pulse. She couldn't think of any of those moments becoming a permanent reality, as it had been so with her father. She didn't think she could bear another loss. Maybe it was selfish, they had lost soldiers whose names she hadn't known, whom she hadn't had that personal relationship with, and while she had mourned, it hadn't paralyzed her decision-making the way the thought of Frildarius descending on her unprepared students did right now. "They won't die," Sothis said with complete confidence, her anger lying underneath it. The young-looking goddess actually managed to smile up at her. "Do you honestly think Felix will allow himself to be bested by an old lady?" Byleth let out a small, weak laugh. "No, he wouldn't," she thought with a sort of hysterical amusement. She could already see the scene in her mind, Felix catching a blast from the arrow of Indra and calling Frildarius a decent enemy, for once. "You kept me waiting," with the same cool confidence and low-key excitement he'd had since she met him. Her hands shivered as she shifted the clock not back to the beginning of the storming, she'd only do that if things went further south than this, but to the moment where Michael had just emerged from the stairwell. "Felix, Bernadetta, everyone, please be safe." Breathing out, she finalized the magic and linear time restarted. Immediately she stopped what she was doing and slipped past Rhea/Sirios, ready with the creator's sword raised for when Michael tore across the room and thrust it at the other woman. She managed to knock it aside, not easily, mind you, she could feel the older blade's strength resisting the hit even as she managed to push it far enough aside to protect Rhea. Mike, what are you doing here?" Lamine rasped out, sounding both faintly amused and almost sad. Following orders, we've been told to retreat soon, Angel," Michael responded in turn, pulling back and circling around her as she and Rhea took to standing side by side. Atra slipped into the room, joining them despite the fear in her eyes and how tightly she clung to her swords. She stood between Lamine and Raphael as he and Marianne carried Casper's limp form out of the room. The White D dragons won't be confined to the throne room for much longer. Thought so. Those fuckers, Angel spat, even as her hands raised in preparation to cast Abraxas again. Rhea's complexion became as white as their reanimated flesh. "White dragons," she repeated, her knuckles turning white on her sword hilt. Atra mouthed out the words silently, her eyes widening as the implications sank in. Byleth had no idea what was going on, but she was hit with another wave of confusion and rage from Sothis that caused her to grab her head. "What are you talking about? How can there be dragons in the throne room? What have they done?" The last words were screamed as she lunged forward. "Sothis, please, you're hurting me," Byleth pleaded as she scrambled to keep up. Lamine fired Abraxas at Rhea and she barely managed to dodge a lance thrust from Bladed. Fortunately for her, Atra came to her aid, forcing the Revenant to dodge a stream of flame and move away from his companion who was now in combat with Rhea. "What the Aluaes do," Michael responded bitterly, seconds before lunging at her again. Byleth dodged again, allowing more of Sothis's power to rush through her body in the process. This. Chapter 77. Dimitri was so distracted by the noise of bolting, blessed Constance had finally been freed up enough to provide him and Claude some covering fire, and avoiding getting his head shot off that he almost missed the wall to his left being utterly demolished. Another bolting from their ever-reliable blonde companion forced Regin to throw himself to the right, hitting the ground and rolling over his shoulder. Claude tracked him with his eyes and fired an arrow at him. Regan, who'd been starting to straighten up, threw himself flat on the floor. Dimitri swallowed hard and ran forward, crossing the yards between them as the Revenant started to stand up again. Ren saw him coming as he got up on one knee, his orange-red eyes widened as he tried to bring up Mirror Fail Not, but the bone relic was the length of a longbow. He spent several precious seconds trying to lift it high enough to be held straight, and that was what Dimitri needed to tackle him. Slamming into the Revenant, the first thing Dimitri noticed was how cold he was. It was tangible even though their clothes and heavy cloak. Upon grabbing Ren's neck and arm to try and immobilize him, he felt the cold seep right through his thick gloves into his palms. Kneeling on the man's chest, Dimitri had half expected to smell rot. Instead his nose was assaulted by a strange medley of unfamiliar scents and seemed both sterile and nausea-inducing. Ren had braced for the impact, holding onto his bow when similar impacts had caused enemies to lose all sense on top of dropping their weapons. He wasn't given more than a second to relish the first real hit they'd inflicted on the enemy archer since Happy's attack. Dmitri! Felix's warning scream hit his nerves like ice water. The sheer shock of hearing his cold friend audibly terrified for him caused Dmitri to freeze up in surprise for a second too long. Then something hot and painful hit him square in the back, sending him sprawling into the pile of rubble that had once been the statue of Wilhelm I. His vision spun and briefly went white with pain. He narrowly avoided biting his tongue and pushed himself up onto his knees, blinking rapidly as he searched for what, or who, had hit him. The warmth of Fortify washed over him, healing the painful magic burn on his back and the cracks in his bones that had been caused by the impact. He still hurt, which was a sign of how powerful the hit had been. Magic had always been a weakness of his. And just straight ahead was the source of his pain. Byleth had described the Falcon Knight she'd fought at Lake Tutates in great detail. The woman across the hallway from him, dressed in light steel armor and the same black cloaks that both Michael Bladed and Ren Regan were fond of. Her long inky gray hair was tied back in a low ponytail, which whipped over her shoulder as she spun and dodged Felix's first attack. "Watch out!" Bernie cried out from where she stood in the doorway to the hall, before firing arrows at a target past him. Cursing, Dmitri gave his head a violent shake to clear it and scrambled back to his feet, slinging Eridbar off his back as he frantically looked for Regan. The Revenant was back on his feet, his own relic weapon retrieved, but he was scrambling backwards to avoid Bernadetta's attack, giving him precious seconds to regain his footing. Two of them, Dmitri thought with a wave of panic. "I thought the other two might have been pulled back already. If they're both here, where is Bladed? Keep away from them." Felix snarled, swiping at the Falcon Knight who dodged him again. "Why you're be broadcasting," the woman said in a tone that was, almost chiding. She lightly smacked Felix's arm with the flat of her black metal lance, the same eerie shimmering material the obsidian daggers were made of. Dmitri looked between his childhood friend and Claude, who was moving somewhat closer to Bernadetta while continuing to shoot at Regan, that feeling of panic intensifying as he tried to figure out who he should try to help first. "Don't look where you're planning to hit me." She took a much harsher swing at his head moments later, forcing Felix to scramble backwards. As she turned fully to face him, Dimitri's breath caught in his throat at the sight of another Aegis shield, Shiva Dash, strapped across her back. Ingrid loved tales of Renata Frildarius and her aerial combat skills. He should have guessed the Falcon Knight's identity as soon as he realized who Bladed was. "Why you're good, and no question," Frildarius went on before snapping her lance forward, its blade wreathed with eerie unnatural blue light. Felix's eyes widened. He brought his Aegis shield up in time to block the spear of magic that flew from the lance's tip aimed right at his face. But this is your first war, and it shows." So, let us begin while we have the tea time, yes." What are you talking about?" Bernadetta asked fearfully, even as she squeezed her bow tight and fired at Frildarius to give Felix more breathing room. Frildarius pivoted on one foot so the arrows would harmlessly strike her bone shield while she parried again and again, first knocking Felix's sword to one side and then jumping to the side to block Leonie's lance strike. "Tea to prepare," Frildarius responded, something in her voice sending a shudder up Dimitri's spine beyond the unnatural, raspy nature of her voice. It might have been determination, resignation, fear, or even dread, or maybe all of those things. He couldn't be sure, her tones were too warped. For the awakening of T the K-King." Then she darted forward like an arrow, the lance lashing out and stabbing Felix in the shoulder. Dmitri dropped to one knee, narrowly avoiding getting his head shot off by Ren, who seemed to not have slowed down at all, and felt a massive spike of fear as he tried to figure out what he should do. Thankfully, he was relieved of the terrible choice of which of his loved ones to support by a flurry of silver arrows from the other side of the room that forced Ren to jump backwards again. "Go, Dmitri," Indek assured him, emerging from the hallway as the Inexhaustible fired more ghostly arrows at Ren, who dove behind one of the largely undamaged pillars in the hall. "I remember how to fight him." Dmitri glanced at Claude, who nodded with a faint smile before taking off toward Indeka's side. Feeling as though his chest had just been released from a vice, Dmitri got up, spun around and rushed toward Felix, who was entirely on the defensive. Frildarius was quick as the wind in the trees, not fazed in the slightest by Bernadetta and now Leonie circling around her and joining the conflict. Slinging the mirror aegis off her back onto her left arm, Frildarius whipped her lance around in a circle as the blade discharged magic again. Bernadetta shrieked and dropped. Leonie was a second behind her, a cry of pain escaping her lips as the magic grazed the top of her head, setting her hair ablaze. Quickly she pulled her cape up over her head and smothered the flames, all while clutching her skull in pain. She pushed through the pain anyway to bring her bow up again and fired. Frildarius winced slightly as the arrow got stuck in her leather, but didn't break her stride. She caught his gauntlets on the length of the arrow of Indra, twisted the lance 90 degrees, and fired the lance's magic up at the ceiling. It wasn't obvious what she was doing at first, but Dida recoiled backwards moments later, shaking his gauntlets as though they were suddenly burning against her skin. How Frildarius saw him coming, Dimitri wasn't sure, but as he crossed the grounds with Eridbar at the ready, she kicked Felix backwards and brought the mirror aegis up in time to catch the lance as he brought its blade down on her arm. The impact staggered her, causing her to stumble backward underneath his strength. Gritting her teeth, Frildarius then dropped down, letting him push her toward the floor while she swung the arrow in an attempt to pierce his leg. The angle meant that she only cut a rough, largely superficial scar into the side of his leg, but it still hurt enough that he jerked back, kicking at the arrow to move it out of the way. He'd been thrown off enough that Frildarius extracted herself from underneath Eridbar and rolled to the side. A golden arrow whipped past his skull by inches. Dimitri jumped and thought somewhat inanely, their loyalty to each other is quite something, if nothing else. Ren was quite occupied, judging by the noise of magic arrows shattering on stone and marble behind him, yet still had a chance to give his old friend some breathing room. Frildarius was back on her feet. Dimitri's eyes quickly snapped back to her, blocking the arrow with Eridbar once and twice as she moved to the right and the left, a grimace on her face as more and more attacks came toward her from various places. She was light on her feet as a feather, lashing out with the arrow to stab at Felix one moment, then fire the magic bolt at Bernadetta, catching her in the shoulder. Leonie, part of her hair burnt away by the magic attack, fired at her again as she stepped protectively in front of Bernadetta while Mercedes cast physic on their younger friend. This arrow caught Frildarius in the shoulder. She staggered again, but firmly kept herself on her feet. Felix came to Dimitri's side and charged at Frildarius again, blocking the arrow on the aegis shield and pushing the blade up over his head in order to get close to her. Frildarius moved, blocking Dimitri's attack and discharging more magic along the blade. The heat grazed Dimitri's neck and sent him scrambling backwards, grabbing his throat to stop any bleeding. Mercedes came to his rescue as he dropped to one knee, his vision blurring slightly even after the moment she healed the wound. Dimitri didn't waste a second standing up again. He swung Eridbar at Frildarius's leg. She managed to block it with the arrow, but the impact caused her to buckle under Felix's sword strike on the mirror aegis. Grimacing, she pushed Felix backward and then used the shield as a bludgeoning weapon, right as Shiva's blood flared to life around her. Felix's sword snapped under the attack, allowing her to smack him in the face with the shield and extract herself from the trap she'd been in. "Felix!" Bernadetta cried, but not out of fear. She aimed and fired a familiar ghostly volley at Frildarius, then let her blow slide down her arm as she unbuckled the rapier from her side and threw it across the floor. Felix, shaking off his initial shock and raging headache, possible concussion, really, rolled over his shoulder and grabbed the weapon off the ground. So armed again, he scrambled back to his feet as Frildarius rounded on them again. Her orange-red eyes were gleaming. Distantly Dimitri thought it reminded him of the monastery cats, predatory with a hint of satisfaction. "I don't suppose you've absorbed anything from Khalid's scheming that might help right now," Felix said sourly. He had a pretty nasty-looking head wound from the mirror aegis which was dripping blood down his face. "Don't get hit again," Dimitri responded flatly, watching the circling Frildarius warily. A number of reinforcements had sprung up from the back stairwells, momentarily preoccupying their friends in support. More worryingly, plaster and stone was falling from the ceiling as part of the walkway to their left collapsed thanks to the damaged pillars giving way. "And watch out for the ceiling." "Great," Felix gritted his teeth. An enormous crashing noise echoed from behind him, the splintering of heavy oak wood and the bending of steel. Dimitri didn't dare take his eyes off their opponent even for a second to figure out what had caused it. Frildarius, meanwhile, tensed up and looked in alarm at something behind them. "Down," she snapped. "What?" That almost sounded like a warning, but that couldn't be. "Down," And now? Frildarius snarled, her voice so forceful it almost sounded normal. Felix's eyes widened, Dmitri blinked and suddenly she was standing right in front of them. She gave him a violent shove that knocked him onto his back before grabbing Felix's arm and flinging both of them a dozen meters to the right. Seconds later, a massive beam of white light filled his vision. It was pure, concentrated magic, that much Dmitri could tell from the way it heated his skin and seared into his mind even as he shut his eyes to save his sight. He heard an enormous crash, louder than bolting or meteor, louder than when the two fail-not arrows had collided not long ago, louder even than the roars of the colossal demonic beasts. It was followed by the sound of stone crumbling and a lot of frightened/alarmed yelling. Blinking frantically as he rolled onto his knees, Dmitri turned around to see where the beam had come from. And, not for the first time since the Nabateans and Agarthans had risen to Fodlan's surface again, his breath caught in his throat in both awe and horror. Thrashing its wings and tail like it was trying to buck something/someone off its back and roaring furiously, the white-scaled dragon burst out of the imperial throne room, flying overhead in the blink of an eye. Its scales glittered like diamonds and freshly fallen snow. It was noticeably smaller than Sirius's immaculate one form but at least as big as a wolf demonic beast, but that was where any similarities with those monsters ended. Its form was elegant, almost beautiful in a terrifyingly remote way. Its roars rang like a dozen bells sending chills down his spine. Then its head swung off to the left at some hapless imperial soldier, white light forming up in its mouth. Seconds later another massive beam of light blasted across the room, striking the man, throwing him through two walls and disintegrating his body along with the stone. Dmitri had to throw up an arm to protect his vision from the light. What in the world is this now? He wasn't even given a chance to ponder that question before another bell-like roar echoed from within the throne room chamber. Seconds later, another dragon burst out into the hallway, shooting up to the high ceiling and slamming into it violently. It dropped a few feet, then threw itself upward again and again as if trying to bash its way through the stone, plaster, wood, and shingles up to the sky above. Then another one flew out, smacking straight into one of the pillars and screeching in displeasure. It was flailing around as though it couldn't really perceive the world around it except for the pain that it was in. What is this? The first dragon wheeled around and started to draw in another breath for attack, aimed directly at the hallway entrance Leonie, Bernadetta, Mercedes, and the others were hiding in. Their friends quickly split up and threw themselves in opposite directions just in time to avoid the massive beam of devastation that tore through the floor straight across and up out through the side wall. That snapped Dmitri out of his shock. Whatever they aren't our friends. Grabbing Eridbar off the ground, he frantically looked around for Felix. His friend was sprawled on the ground a few yards away, groaning as the light green light of Cethlene's magic surrounding him as he tried to recover. Frildarius, meanwhile, rolled back to her feet, being undead blunting any damage she received. Did she and the others even feel any pain anymore? Pointed the arrow of Indra at one of the dragons and fired a magic bolt at its wing. The blow hit home, causing the dragon, who had been about to drive bomb Didu and Mercedes, who were scrambling out from underneath a part of the balcony that hadn't collapsed yet that had provided them crucial cover, to screech in pain and drop several feet down. Dmitri gasped and glanced back at her, saw her grimace and the look of loathing and regret in those otherwise remote orange-red eyes as she stared up at the glittering being. Then she vanished in the familiar magic of rewarp. Dmitri shot over to Felix's side and grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet while looking wildly between the three dragons flying and writhing overhead. Another flicker of pinkish-red light flared off at the side, telling him that Ren von Regen had warped out as well. That's not a coincidence. This is a final spiteful response to our victories in Adrestia from Thales, and probably designed to kill as many people as possible. Dragons, how could they? Scatter, scatter! Claude shouted, his voice splitting through the fog of shock that had wreathed his mind. His voice was fierce and commanding with only a trace of the confused panic that he must have felt to a degree at this sudden new threat. Stay on your toes and stay away from anything that could collapse on you. Keep one eye on the ceiling, archers, you're up front. Try to surround them, don't let them focus on you for more than a moment. Indek added his voice to the orders, aiming the inexhaustible and unleashing a storm of arrows out at the dragon still circling around the left hallway, waiting for someone to emerge from the hallway into its field of vision. What are they? Dmitri called out to the Nabatean, running after Felix as his friend rushed toward Bernadetta, who had taken up position behind a pillar and started shooting arrows up at the dragons. His response was a little unnerving. "I don't know." The dragon that had been trying to bash its way out through the ceiling howled in rage and frustration and unleashed a breath attack straight down. Ignatz and Sylvain were wrapped in the bright green light of rescue and yanked out of the way before the blast rained down on the ground they'd been standing on. Claude darted from one place of cover to another and fired fail not up at the dragon in retaliation. The golden arrow whisked through the air and struck its wing. The dragon screeched in pain and dropped several dozen feet down. Leonie appeared from behind a pillar and unleashed 2 arrows from her brave bow with a furious yell. The attack wasn't as tangibly harmful as Claude's, but it did cause the dragon to snarl and spin in a circle looking for its tormentors. Dimitri didn't have a lot of time to contemplate this. He wrenched a short spear out of the body of a fallen war master and darted toward the first white dragon that had appeared, pushing Vishnu's magic through the length of the weapon until it was surrounded by a white haze. Bernadetta and Indek were shooting at it already, aiming specifically for the wings. 2 storms of ghostly arrows hailed the creature's sides. The dragon screeched in pain. The noise rattled Dimitri's skull and nearly sent him to his knees with how forceful it was. He nearly tripped, but righted himself. Taking aim for a moment, he threw the short spear up at the dragon's neck. The impact tore through the magic barrier and pierced the scales, Vishnu's blood coming to his aid again, though it didn't go all the way through the dragon's neck. It did, however, cut off the beam attack that had been building up in its mouth. Flickering blue-white embers fell from its mouth as it thrashed in place, all 4 legs flailing wildly and tail whipping out toward him. He ducked underneath it. It was still pretty high in the air, too high up for him to get a decent hit on it with Eridbar unless he threw the bone lance. Leonie kept shooting at its wings. Bernadetta, meanwhile, shrieked, "Watch out, Annette," and shot at the second dragon, which was now dive-bombing toward the orange-haired girl, who was standing with her back to it, trying to help them bring the dragon down. The flurry of silver ghostly arrows brought the dragon up short. One of them had miraculously struck one of its eyes. However, it swung its wings forward to right itself, and the blast of winds hit Annette with enough force to send her tumbling to the ground right underneath the first dragon, right as Indeka's arrows pierced through one of its wings. Dimitri didn't think, he just moved. Darting underneath the dragon as it crashed down toward the floor, grabbed the wobbly Annette by the shoulders and slung her out of the way at the last moment. Then the dragon crashed down on top of him with its full weight. All the wind was knocked out of Dimitri's lungs. One of the dragon's paws had landed on his shoulders, its claws digging into the edge of his shoulder and the floor beneath it. Pain shot through his back. He's pretty sure something cracked but didn't break. What was really scary was feeling sharp rocks digging into the hand that he'd brought up at the last second to protect his eyes when the impact had struck home. Through the haze of pain he thought, "Thank goodness I managed to protect my eyes." He was too dazed to make out the words making up the scream he heard seconds later, but he recognized Claude's voice all the same. Gritting his teeth and forcing himself to focus despite the agony in his chest and how blurry his vision was, the young king took advantage of the dragon rising up from the ground to shift his grip on Eridbar, turn it around and slam the blade deeply into the beast's stomach. Then he activated Atrocity with a surge of magic. Something over his head burst, red and gold blood rained down on him and his arm dropped to the ground, completely numb. The dragon's final screech echoed through the room as Dimitri tried to move out of the way of its falling body. Being winded, he only really managed to get halfway there. The dragon's wing fell over him and the body landed on his legs, causing another racking wave of pain to blur his vision. The weight didn't remain on him for very long. There was a sound like tinkling glass, and as Dimitri blinked his vision clear, he saw the wing over him dissolving into starlight and diamonds. Dazed, he slowly pulled his legs back toward his chest as the weight on them lessened significantly and turned around to see the result. The shimmering starlight lifted up toward the ceiling, leaving a few bones and a small body of a child, 8 or 9 at the eldest, now lying still across his legs. Her hair was as silver as Lysithea's, and there were multiple neat, surgical scars on what flesh wasn't covered by the long funeral dress she was wearing. Dimitri let out a racking cough. Despite suspecting it was pointless, he tentatively reached out and touched the girl's neck. No pulse, and she was cold and still as the grave. She had Edelgard's face. Dimitri stared in creeping disbelief and dread at her body before he was suddenly wrapped in warm healing magic. Sucking in a deep lungful of air, "Goddess, that was a relief." Dimitri picked Eridbar up from the floor and carefully slid his legs out from under the girl's body. as if trying not to disturb her from her sleep. Then he got back to his feet, and suddenly his arms were full of Felix Frildarius. "You idiot!" his old friend raged while hugging him tightly, seemingly forgetting that there were 2 other dragons in the room, though to be fair, they were currently under significant pressure from seemingly every archer in the building. "You couldn't have thrown yourself out of the way too. Why won't you be more careful?" "I'm sorry," Dmitri responded, equal parts bewildered and elated by the gesture. "Idiot," Felix repeated, letting go of him and skittering back a bit to glare at him, a look that was rather undermined by the fear, worry, and a million other emotions still fading out of his eyes. "No wonder Claude has to save you all the time." Dmitri started to say something in response when blazing light blasted out of the throne room, starlight and fire both, followed by a shockwave of power that nearly threw everyone off their feet. Byleth stormed out of the throne room. No, it wasn't quite Byleth. It was Suthi's, divine power radiating off her slender frame and possessed with singular purpose and a pure unending wrath. Dmitri had never seen her so enraged. He'd heard plenty of stories about the goddess's rage, both from the church and in many of the fables that Faerghus so loved. But the look of rage in her eyes, so tangible that he could feel it in his bones despite how far away they were from each other, was completely terrifying on a level that he'd never experienced before. "Begone!" Suthis shouted, raising one hand. "Serious?" Felix grabbed Dmitri by the arm and yanked him back to the wall behind a pillar in a large pile of rubble. Dmitri shut his eyes and threw his arm up for good measure. The noise, the sound, the color, the magic defied description. Somehow it made him think of looking up at the night sky, yet that didn't do justice to it. He felt the intensity and the weight of the attack even as it rushed harmlessly past him and Felix. It made his crest throb within him and threatened to send him to his knees. The attack ceased a few moments later. Dazed and a little uncertain, Dmitri stepped back into the main hall to find the 2 remaining dragons vaporized down to starlight and the human bodies, 2 more silver-haired teenagers lying still as death on the floor. Suthis stood on the stairs to the throne room, breathing heavily and pressing both her hands against her forehead. As he began to approach, her image flickered and then dissolved, leaving Byleth in her place, and Byleth promptly collapsed on the stairs, gasping for breath. Marianne almost warped to her side, kneeling and asking her concerned questions as Rhea emerged from the throne room behind them. Lysithea walked across the hall, staring blankly at the bodies left behind by the dragons. She wasn't in any more danger. What enemies remained in the room after that attack either warped away or fled out of the various breaches in the palace wall, abandoning the fight. Others surrendered. Breathing out, Dmitri began to make his way toward Byleth. Claude met him halfway, grabbing him in a crushing hug after dropping Failnaught to the floor. Dmitri's heart sank when he heard his prince utter a muffled sob against his shoulder and embraced him back tightly, gently kissing his neck and murmuring comforting words and apologies in an attempt to ease his trembling. "Where's the Emperor?" Glenn called out. He was leaning slightly on Ingrid while Atra darted across the room, waving to Mercedes and Marianne. "Gone," Byleth responded, making Dmitri's heart skip a beat. "She wasn't there in the throne room, no one's seen her." "She can't have gone far," he protested as Claude recomposed himself and released him from his embrace. "Not on her own," Claude reasoned. Something flashed through his green eyes as he glanced at Lysithea, who was still staring down at the bodies of the silver-haired children. But Thales might have taken her with him while withdrawing, on his way back to Shamhala. He clearly gave Anbar up before we even got into the palace. "She wouldn't have agreed to that," Dorothea noted. "No, she wouldn't have," Claude agreed grimly. "Why would he have taken her away?" Dmitri asked, shaking his head. He almost didn't want to believe it, to hope that she had fled or was hidden somewhere else in the palace, but he had a sinking suspicion that Claude was right. "Thales said that he needed her for something," Atra suggested. "She clearly believed she was indispensable to him, that it made her an equal to him rather than his pawn. But what could she have to offer him aside from Adrescha's army or that bone axe he provided for her? I know he never considered the Empire anything but a disposable toolset, but he said once before that he had given her the strength needed to reforge the world. I thought he'd been talking about his support. That's clearly not the case, though, if he just left this place to be captured by us." "I think I know why," Lysithea said suddenly. Her voice was terribly remote, like she'd just woken from a bad dream. I hadn't been sure up until this point, but now I'm certain. Now, I understand everything. What could you possibly mean by that, Lys? Hilda asked, walking over and putting a concerned hand on her shoulder. Lysithea shuddered. Let's just clean up here. Then I'll tell you. She's right, Dmitri said, pitching his voice to carry so all the soldiers within could hear him. We must ensure that Inber can be held in our absence as quickly as possible. Whoever is least injured and exhausted, start forming groups to sweep and investigate the rest of the palace. Lady Eisner, Lord Regan, and I will go and assess the general army's condition before joining you. They'd won the battle, but the war still wasn't over. Shamhala loomed in his mind's eye, and he couldn't help but cast his eyes over to Atra and Glenn, both of whom looked grim. They were clearly thinking the same thing as him, the worst wasn't behind them yet. He remembered Frildarius warning them, then pushing him and Felix out of the way of the White Dragon's attack. He pondered how she'd almost seemed like she was mentoring them, giving them a lesson in close combat even as she was compelled to try and kill them. Her warning echoed in his mind. To prepare for the awakening of the king. Did that mean what he thought it might? A chill of fear went down his spine, and lingered there even as Byleth crossed the floor and hugged him in relief, still a little shaky. Chapter 78. Lord Regan? King Blade did? There's a woman at the gates who's asking to speak to you. Claude grunted as he dropped one last shovelful of dirt into the grave he'd just finished before driving the blade into the ground, taking a moment to wipe his forehead. He tried not to sulk when he glanced at Dmitri and noted that the blonde wasn't stressed whatsoever by their said task. It was perfectly sensible, seeing as he could lift an entire carriage with his bare hands. Moving dirt wouldn't stress him at all. How urgent is it? He asked, trying not to sigh or otherwise sound annoyed. The messenger was just doing his job, after all, and considering the state Inber was in, there could be any number of emergencies that might need his, Dimitri's, or Byleth's attention. Suthies knew that Seath, Rhea, Indek, Rodrigue, and Judith were being stretched razor-thin trying to handle securing the city, finding any remaining civilians, tending to the injured and everything else they needed to do to ensure they held Inber as quickly as possible. They probably should be out there themselves. Byleth was sweeping the palace with Atra's help, backed up by their friends and Shamir. The renegade Agartha undoubted any of Thal's people were lingering in Adrestia at this point, but insisted they needed to make sure that no other traps had been rigged to explode on them in the aftermath. She described a few disturbing machines that she had been taught to set up as a combat medic, which was more than enough to convince Rodrigue and Judith to lend extra soldiers to the endeavor. Claude would like to have helped. But he didn't want Dmitri and Lysithea to be left to bury the princes and princesses Hresvelg alone. The royal graveyard was, startlingly untouched, considering how spectacularly destroyed most of the palace and city were. Byleth was seriously concerned about the palace's structural integrity with how many pillars Ren had shot out and how many holes in the wall Frildarius and Lamine had created during the fight. Everyone except the inspection team had been evacuated from the old building and they were proceeding with extreme caution, and Indek watching them from the ground floor. An elegant statue of Saint Cethline, he wondered if Flane had seen it yet, overlooked the simple plot of land, which was ringed by ancient trees and beautiful wildflowers that wound themselves around the spiked iron fence. There were rows of graves already there, smooth and artly cut colored rock denoting the emperors of old and extolling their accomplishments. You can tell which ones were less loved by the size of their tombstones. For the past 4 hours, the three of them had dug 9 new graves for Edelgard's brothers and sisters. Claude remembered placing the youngest, the 8-year-old girl who had slowly morphed back to her human form after dying, pinning Dmitri beneath her weight. Her body had been so fragile when he picked her up, he'd seen the fractures, the breaks in her small, so small, form, the unnatural twists and stunts that told him more than words ever could. After the insurrection of the Seven, it hadn't passed Fodlan by that all but one of the Hresvelgers had lost their minds or died, one by one. Duke Agir, with all the solemnity of his station, explained that they'd fallen victim to a vicious mutation of the plague that had hit Adrestia some years beforehand. His grandfather had called it the fakest thing I'd ever heard, but never could figure out a more obvious explanation for what could have happened to them. Which naturally meant it was Agartha. Claude knew he was missing a lot of context. He also had more questions than he knew what to do with. Why the heirs of Adrestia, Why risk exposure with such well-known and protected victims? How long had they been in the empire? Ionius was famous for being a somewhat lazy, indecisive ruler, which led to the Hrym uprising, had that been because of Agarthan influence. With that in mind, how much autonomy had Edelgard had since she started the war? He knew which question was weighing on Dimitri's mind. Dimitri had confided in him, way back when they were students, about his relationship with Edelgard and her mother, consort Anselma/Queen Patricia. He'd been pretty odd at how King Lambert, a famously direct and honest man, managed to pull off both legitimizing the marriage to the imperial emperor's former concubine and keep it a secret. Then the war had started and he'd been heartbroken for his Mitya, who'd, seemingly, thank goodness for Altina, lost the last family he had left in the worst way possible. His poor king had finally started to sort out his feelings regarding his stepsister and what a foul emperor she'd proven to be, only to be thrown for this loop. It just wasn't fair. Lysithea was a bit more of an enigma, which both bothered and worried him. Her reaction to the white dragons, how unsurprised she seemed to see them transfer back to the Hresvelg siblings, her sharing that silver white hair that each of them possessed, it made him wonder, how well did he know his sassy, spiky friend? What had she been hiding from them? What had she been suffering all alone? Well, sir, she has Princess Justine with her. Dimitri jerked away from the grave he'd been standing in front of, whirling around to stare at the messenger. Excuse me? The blonde demanded, shocked. Lysithea had done a quick turnabout as well, her mouth dropping open at the words. The messenger, an older man, likely pushing 55/60 judging by the natural silver streaks in his hair and the many wrinkles to his face. She's been kept out of sight within the palace for years, under orders from the man Lady H recalls Thales. The woman who has her now served under him, but a week before your army was due to arrive she woke me in the middle of the night, holding her in her arms, demanding to be shown the palace's escape routes. I didn't think I'd see either of them again. I'm on my way, Dimitri promised, slamming his spade into the ground in front of the graves and glancing at him. Well, doesn't this sound interesting? Claude mused, glancing at Lysithea and smiling. What do you think, Lysithea? Lysithea punched him in the shoulder without saying a word, not very hard, but it had noticeably more strength behind it than her usual mock punches when he got on her nerves. Let's go, we're close to being done here, she said. We can do the last few touches at any time. He nodded, reminding himself that she had promised to talk to them so he didn't have to shake her and try to trick her into admitting what was eating away at her. He wondered if he was going to learn yet another truth he was going to be horrified he didn't realize sooner. Shaking his head, Claude followed Dimitri and Lysithea down the stone and grass pathway that led toward the castle. It had been very quiet in the graveyard and the palace itself. As they approached the city, the noise raised by the general orderly chaos ongoing in Inver felt like a tangible thing the closer they returned to it. From their vantage point looking down on the imperial capital, Claude could see the devastation they'd inflicted on it and couldn't help but cringe a bit. Even knowing they did their best to save the civilians Edelgard had tried to use as meat shields against them didn't fully assuage his guilt and regret as he looked down on the ruins of the once majestic city. He wondered what Rhea was thinking or feeling right now. She built this city from the ground up with Wilhelm, her dear friend who helped her avenge her family. He wondered how Seath and Flayn were feeling. Wasn't Flayn's mother Angelica from Inver? She'd said something like that to Ignatz a few days ago, he was pretty sure. Bloody hell, where were the civilians going to stay for the winter? There was no way they'd be able to fully reconstruct the city before the first snowfall. Suthies, he might have to send them to Almira with his mother and Nader. It was warm all year round in parts of his father's homeland, and bountiful. Almira was larger than Fodlan, after all, and the fewer people left behind to suffer the famine Edelgard's actions would inflict on Adrestia the better. Of course, convincing his prideful people to accept powerless refugees was probably going to take a few honor battles. Oh well, a few more fights with the elites ought to be more than enough to prepare him for that. Claude heard the increasingly familiar cheerful and reverent calls of their names from civilians close enough to see them. He turned in their direction to smile and wave warmly. He could have sworn he heard a few young women swoon, judging by how Dimitri's eye twitched slightly, so did he. Not that he got to think much about it. The messenger led them up onto the front steps of the palace where two figures were waiting for them. Claude heard his breath hitch a bit when they stopped a few feet away from their new guest and her companion. "Your Highnesses." "My lady." The pale-skinned woman with dark red hair was young, probably about the same age as Catherine, unless Claude missed his guess. She fumbled with her words, uncertain how to address them. Her body language was intensely nervous and defensive, and her shoulders hunched in defensively when she lifted her head to look them in the eyes. The tremors were too consistent and intense to be faked, and her outfit, a shirt made of an odd fabric that pressed close to her skin and pants without pockets, left no room for concealed weapons. So this gesture was probably legit. Perhaps Atra wasn't as much of an outlier to the general Shamhala population as she thought. "Thank you for acknowledging my request." She moved one hand and gently placed it on the shoulder of her quarry, drawing Claude's analytical observation away from her. Justine von Hresvelg was 14, one of Edelgard's two younger siblings. The first thing he noticed was the chair she was sitting in, because calling it a chair didn't do it any justice. It was constructed from smooth metal, fluffy cushions forming a buffer between the girl's body and the cold steel. Rather than legs, it was hovering a few inches off the ground. Dropping to one knee, Claude realized there was blue-yellow light glowing from the bottom of the four square legs of the chair. There was a faint reflection of symbols on the stone floor beneath it. Looking up, he noticed that there were handles on each side of the back of the chair. So the chair could be pushed along? Glancing at the handlebars, he noted that there were a series of lightly glowing boxes on the handlebars right underneath Justine's hands. "How does that work?" he blurted out. The Agarthan woman let out a startled noise. Seconds later, Claude felt Lysithea's fist smack the back of his head. "Ow!" he protested. "I apologize for him," Lysithea said irritably. "He has no concept of personal space when he's interested in something." A hand reached out and lightly patted the top of his head where his younger friend had hit him. A soft keening noise, faintly questioning and certainly concerned, echoed over his head. Straightening up and squaring his shoulders, Claude found himself more or less face to face with Justine von Hresvelg, who was still gently patting his hair like she was trying to erase Lysithea's blow. The first thing he noticed was the uniform nature of the scars on her neck and the sides of her head not hidden by her white hair. They almost looked like the guidance markings you saw in architectural works, forming neat lines and small diamonds on her skin, which almost seemed as pale as her minders. Her purple eyes were lighter than Edelgard's. She tilted her head when their gaze met and her lips moved as if to say something, only for a soft, rasping questioning sound to escape them. No words, nothing more. "Oh, this." The Agarthan woman put a hand on the chair. "It's a hover chair. It's one of the many medical designs Shamhala possesses to assist those who are crippled. She can't walk, you see, so this allows her to move around on her own to an extent." Justine tilted her head, giving him a concerned look. Claude smiled back at her, taking her hand in his own and giving it a light squeeze. "Don't worry about me. I've taken so many lumps from her I don't even notice anymore." "Hey!" Lysithea protested, though she faltered a bit when Justine's expression brightened. "That's incredible," Dmitri blurted out. It moves on command?" "How?" "I'm afraid I don't know the technical work," the woman said. "There is spinal nerve surgery as another option, but it was far more than I could afford, and I'm not sure the doctors would have permitted it, considering what they ultimately wanted with her." "Your medicine is that good?" Lysithea asked slowly, her face going a bit blank. "If you can afford it," the woman said wearily. "Where have I heard that before?" Claude pondered, standing up. "I'm guessing what you're referring to is those white dragons that got set on us." She shifted from foot to foot, wavering between fear, uncertainty and 100 other feelings flickering through her eyes. "I was her caretaker, ever since the Reclamation War was started. I wasn't meant to, she wrapped her arms around herself. Justine, sensing her distress, reached out and touched her arm in concern. "She's sweet, harmless. We hurt her. I didn't want anything else to happen to her. So I disobeyed Thales and pretended that she died, then slipped away with her. Of course, I don't have anywhere safe to take her or any more medicine." She hesitantly met their eyes again. "Thales is afraid of you. He won't admit it, but he retreated from the surface. He swore that once we left Shamhala, we'd never go back underground again, but he retreated from you. So I hoped that you would be able to give her sanctuary. I know that her sister attempted to conquer your lands and kill you, but I swear she wasn't involved in anything. She can't walk or speak, and hates seeing people in pain. She's helpless. Justine flinched violently at Thales's name, tears of fear forming in the corners of her eyes. Of course we will, Dmitri said simply, stepping forward and kneeling in front of the crippled girl, clasping her hand in his. Is that all right, Justine? She blinked rapidly at him, giving him a bright yet shy smile in response. What's your name? Claude asked, tilting his head. The woman jolted a bit, looking taken aback. It's Lucy, Your Highness. Lucy, then. A nice name. A slightly unusual one, too. Was it a derivative of Lysithea, or the other way around? Atras told me about what Thales does to people who disobey him. You're probably better off coming with us too. Justine clearly trusts you, and you saved her from ending up like her siblings, he didn't say. He wasn't sure if Justine knew, and didn't want to tell her via an offhand comment. Me? Join your army? Why? I am Agar then, wait, Lucy blinked rapidly, her expression growing increasingly poleaxed as she realized something. Atra? As in? Atra of the surface? We were told that she was killed shortly after breaking into and then out of Shamhala with other deserters. Assassinated. Lysithea's eyebrows migrated upwards. Is that what Thales and his minions are calling her? Wow. Does she know? I don't think she knows. She clapped her hands together and grinned faintly. She's going to make the most amazing face when I tell her. I'm laying claim to telling her, you got that, Khalid. Claude felt his chest grow warm and tight. He told himself it was just because of the clear sky and sunlight. Crystal, he promised before returning his attention to Lucy. Atra will be very surprised to hear that she's dead. Dead people generally can't help Byleth with logistics in the wake of a battle. Or participate in a battle. Or have conversations with people. Unless you're an Einherjar. I promise, this is an offer made in good faith. You don't look like much of a soldier, and I can't in good conscience send anyone back to Thales knowing what he'll do to them. Why, Yuri, right? I'm just a doctor, brought on board to tend to the wounded. Lucy said, still staring at him like he'd spontaneously sprouted wings. Fantastic, Dmitri said, standing up from the quiet, one-sided conversation he'd been having with Justine. The crippled girl had been making strange gestures with her hands, like she was trying to use them to form words instead of her tongue. Dmitri had murmured reassuringly to her, watching attentively to try and understand what she wanted to convey. There are a number of children we captured during this battle who attempted to harm themselves after being captured. Lucy flinched, but didn't look surprised. Claude grimaced briefly but quickly hid it. If you tend to them, and they wake up with you at their side, perhaps they'll feel safe enough to not attempt such a thing again. Oh. I see, the children. I'll do it, Lucy said, giving in and bowing deeply. It was man's bow as opposed to a curtsy, but it was very reverent all the same. I'm unworthy of your kindness, thank you. Merci will love you right away, Lysithea told Justine as she walked in a circle around the hovering chair, pondering how it worked. She's the sweetest lady you're ever run into. Shall we go meet her? Justine blinked a few times, then nodded hesitantly. Beaming, Lysithea turned and examined the city out in front of her. Merci will be at the medical stations. Ugh, it's gonna be a pain trying to navigate this mess discreetly. We'll go with you, Dmitri offered, immediately intuiting what the white-haired girl was concerned about. Claude winked at Justine, causing her to giggle and relax a bit in her chair. Good idea, you'll probably need help to get through that organized chaos. He said. Unless she's moved, I'm pretty sure I know which medical camp Mercedes is hanging out at. The sun was setting when Byleth, Atra, and the others emerged from the precarious but still standing Imperial Palace. Not that it really had any claim to that name anymore. Justine was a Hresvelg, yes, but she'd been formally disqualified from the line of succession due to the nature and the extensiveness of her injuries fatally handicapping her ability to rule. Of course, it was the seven who had said as much. Claude had been worrying the entire day that half of the building would give way with them still inside. He didn't think Byleth had run Divine Pulse dry, but he wasn't sure, so he was practically jumping at every sound of stone crumbling / giving way until he saw those double doors swing open again. Work throughout the day had been hard. Once he, Dimitri and Lysithea had delivered Justine to Mercedes, who, true to form, had descended upon the girl in a cloud of motherly kindness and concern almost the instant she clapped eyes on her, then returned to finish marking the graves of her siblings. They promptly returned to Inber to lend a hand wherever they could. Dimitri had quickly been pulled aside by Indek to help him move rubble to free up blocked houses or rescue soldiers from both sides trapped beneath collapsed buildings. Lysithea had volunteered to sub in for Dorothea in the healing tents, giving the singer a much-needed reprieve. Dorothea took the opportunity to lift their people's spirits by performing routines from various operas she'd performed before. Amazingly, the opera house of all places had survived the battle mostly unscathed. Seath and his people were shifting things so it could double as a shelter for people displaced from their homes. Claude had joined the interrogators, shaking down what Imperial commanders had survived the battle for any information that might come in handy later. It was slow going to say the least. All the commanders were fanatically loyal to Edelgard in her vision. They swore and spat at him and the others non-stop, daring them to torture them and prove their righteousness. It was kind of disturbing, really. They had lost this war so completely, yet they were still talking about fighting? It wasn't just the hubris of nobility, either. A number of them were merchant class who had gone into the military and rose up the ranks thanks to Edelgard's merit policies. It was an irreligious worship of Edelgard and the idea of Adrestia as the one true kingdom of Fodlan. You will never know peace. One of them had laughed maniacally as Claude made to leave after judging talking to him to be a waste of time. You will never be welcome here, half-blood. Do you really think a mutt like you will be accepted here, a thief daring to defile the lands of the Emperor? The people of Adrestia will rise against you as they rose against Nemesis. We will never rest until righteousness and justice prevails over you and your puppets. We'll have to execute them, Claude thought morosely. We can't kill all of Edelgard's loyalists, it would both be impractical and immoral, but the commanders would serve as a rallying point. He sighed heavily. They'd probably try to put Justine on the throne as a puppet emperor, rule through her, public executions for the lot of them after we make Shamhala's crimes public and deliver our formal declaration of war against them. Suthies dammit. I'm sick of this bloodshed, I'm sick of these pointless deaths. He kicked the dirt roughly, causing Atra to give him a concerned look. He flashed her a wry half-smile and waved to tell her not to worry about him. Damn you to the seventh hell, Edelgard. Rhea had set up a fire pit for her siblings and the students outside of the city gates. There were large clumps of soldiers and civilians hovering around other fires and the many tents that had been pitched over the course of the day. One particularly large one was a medical one. Flane stumbled out of it a few minutes ago, yawning immensely, and looking a little grey thanks to the sheer amount of healing she'd been performing across the day. Ignatz had hurried to her side and guided her to the fire pit, accepting a pure water from Constance to buoy up her magic. Lysithea, you have the floor, Byleth said as she sat next to him on the log that was serving as their seats. They formed a large circle around the bonfire that was now roaring away in its center. Rhea, Seath, and Indek had slipped away from whatever they'd been doing to join them as well. Rhea's body language was tense as a strung bow, only a little less so than after the white dragons had transformed back into the Hresvelg siblings. Or the ground, I suppose. Sylvain chuckled a bit, then winced when Dorothea elbowed him. He glanced at her to complain, only to hush when he saw her worried gaze lingering on the young mage, who was bouncing one knee on the log across from her. Cyril, who was sitting on her right, put a concerned hand on her shoulder. Lysithea? He asked worriedly. I'm all right, Cyril. I'm just figuring out where to start, Lysithea said, before sighing and blowing out a long breath. Take all the time you need, Dimitri assured her. She smiled faintly at him in return, but her eyes had gone dark with memory. She looked grave. As disturbing as it is, I'm almost used to demonic beasts being thrown at us turning back into people rather than bone, Yuri remarked sourly. But dragons, at least, dragons that can't speak and don't seem to have human minds, transforming back into humans? That was new. I can't figure out why they would have been there. And why the Hresvelg kids? Balthus added, frowning. If Edelgard could turn into a dragon and breathe pure concentrated destruction at us, why didn't she lead with that? The imperial family hasn't ever been recorded having such an ability, Lawrence protested. Surely if they'd always had it, it would have been recorded into history at some point. Written history can be altered if you're desperate to hide something, Byleth said solemnly. Claude noticed Rhea flinch out of the corner of his eye and couldn't help a spike of satisfaction it gave him. Not to mention this wouldn't be the first time they kept their own version of history. What do you mean by that? Hilda asked, wrinkling her nose in confusion. While we were looking for information in bolt holes the Agarthan plants might have been using, we came across a secret history record hidden beneath the throne. Atra explained. At first glance I thought it was the work of a previous High Chancellor, but it doesn't mention Agartha anywhere. All it says is that Sirios could transform into a dragon, and that Lady Rhea siphoned the powers of the Emperor starting with the creation of Faerghus up to the modern day. She rolled her eyes. Which is silly, because the Wind King's advisor was a deserter from Shamhala, not the church. Ingrid choked on what she'd been drinking and started hacking and coughing. Glenn worriedly slapped her on the back until her throat cleared. Felix sputtered in shock and Dimitri's mouth dropped open. Claude couldn't help but snicker at the sight and Atra's confused expression. What did you just say? Ash squeaked out. Did I not mention that already? Atra asked dolishly. No, you bloody well didn't. Ingrid wheezed, pressing one hand against her chest. Agartha helped King Lug gain independence. Oh, no. That was not their intention in the slightest. Atra explained, her arms flailing slightly. They sent Pan the Magnificent and his men into King Lug's army as sleeper agents with the expressed message of fueling the war and orchestrating it so it destroyed both kingdoms, so Agartha could swoop in and lay claim to the surface. She shook her head. He's called Pan the Traitor Underground, but I found his memoirs buried at the foot of the tree overlooking his tomb. We just kind of stumbled on it while chasing Agarthan plants out of Gautier territory. Glenn said by way of explanation. You mean you were in my home territory and I managed to walk right past you more than once, without ever finding you? Sylvain asked in dismay. To be fair, we were trying very hard not to be found, Glenn responded sheepishly. I always felt like I was somewhere slightly familiar, but I never really had the chance to follow that feeling somewhere concrete. Pan found his loyalties divided almost as soon as King Lug welcomed him into his inner circle, Atra said. His memoirs express constant awe at the freedom the people of the North have, to travel where they wish without permission, to write tales without censorship, trials that operate on the possibility of innocence being declared, and he fell in love with it, with Lug and his kindness and his sense of responsibility to his people's well-being and happiness. She smiled wistfully. It was so different from Shamhala, and Pan couldn't bring himself to destroy it. Instead he took the mask he had put on and made it his real face, helped Lug win the war, and threw out the plants meant to assassinate him. He and his men assimilated into the kingdom and lived out happy lives there, never returning to Shamhala. She paused, and then turned bright red. Sorry, Lysithea, I barreled right over you there didn't I? No, don't apologize, that's fascinating. Lysithea responded with a faint, if dry, smile. So much for the church, dividing the empire. A round of dry laughter rippled through the group. Rhea looked pissed for a second, but Seath put a meaningful hand on her shoulder and she deflated, looking contrite. Besides, it gave me a chance to put my thoughts in order, the white-haired girl went on. Hey Ferdinand, what do you know about HRYM's history? Not nearly as much as I should, Ferdinand said with a frown. My father always insisted that I had nothing to do with HRYM, despite the fact that I should have been taught to rule over it since the wardship was passed to my family. I always suspected his reasons for it were not altruistic, but... Lysithea snorted. Amazingly, what happened wasn't his machinations. It was because of Ionius the Weak. Dimitri frowned a bit at the epitaph, but Claude thought it was APT. Edelgard's father was famously ruled by his harem. He showered them with public favor to the disgust of the Seven and preferred their advice to nobles. The HRYM uprising occurred when he was trying to consolidate power that had been more spread out among the nobles back to the imperial throne, right? Claude asked. That was before I showed up on land, so I only know what I heard from less than complimentary sources. The Alliance Lords, Mary Ann's adoptive father in particular, considered the whole sordid affair to be ultimate proof that their system of leadership was superior to being at the mercy of a petulant man-child, and lamented the fate of HRYM after the family's failure to break away and join them. That's a bit of an oversimplification, but yes, that was the chief grievance of the HRYM family. For Edelgard to just jurat saw the title, with all the problems that come with it, instead of some kind of doctor for his mind, Lysithea shook his head. My parents offered HRYM a great deal of assistance, getting them in contact with the Round Table, providing money for mercenaries, things like that. When Ionius the Weak managed to subdue the rebellion, I think he was only managed to pull it off by whipping up the nobles over letting that rabble steal more land from us. He was furious with them. So after he put the entire HRYM family to the sword, both Indek and Dimitri's expressions darkened. He sent auditors to our house to exact reparations. She looked up at the sky. They weren't auditors. They were Agarthan doctors. Wait, what? Byleth burst out, eyes wide. Claude barely heard her voice over his own. He'd said the same thing, word for word, his heart leaping into his throat. Where Agarthan doctors appeared, nothing good followed. This was years ago. They had infiltrated the Empire that long ago. Seath asked, stricken. We hadn't suspected a thing. I can hardly believe how careless we've been. Lysithea sighed. They had friends in high places to cover up for them, help from the Seven themselves after the insurrection. They didn't want anyone finding out about them before they were ready. She gave her head a hard shake. The Hresvelg family didn't have the ability to transform into dragons before now. I'm 90% sure of that. She looked over at the Nabateans for confirmation. Rhea nodded in assent, explaining, even the major crests, except for Lien's dash. Mary Ann cringed. Sirios did her best to smile compassionately at her before continuing, don't create the limbs and muscles needed for the shape-shifting. Lysithea blinked a few times. Then she said something that froze Claude's blood in his veins. I guess they wanted to see if two crests changed that. A suffocating silence fell over the circle. Rhea's expression went dangerously blank, while Seath looked alarmed and Indek horrified, like he already suspected where this story was going. Claude felt his mouth open and close without any sound coming out. I don't know if Ionius gave them free rein specifically to do what they did, but honestly, I don't care. I'll never forgive him for leaving us at their non-existent mercy because we offended his pride. Lysithea wrapped her arms around her chest. My siblings and I, we were taken away from our parents and experimented on, one by one. It was horrible. I can still hear Sonia screaming in my nightmares. Human bodies aren't built for divine powers, I think. Their attempted implants failed again and again, and my brothers and sisters died one by one with each failure, until only I was left. And wonder of wonders, I lived. For a certain definition of living. She held both her hands palms up. Claude hissed as two familiar crest symbols, Karen and Gloucester, floated above her hand. Across from him he saw all the blood drain from Lorenz's face as new understanding filled his eyes. They told me that it was a success, but there was a price. The power is so corrosive, divine in a mortal body, that, carrying both of them shortened my life. They said I wouldn't live beyond my 25th birthday. The words rang through the air like a ballistic bullet slamming into stone. Claude didn't remember standing up. His mind was in a complete haze. Moments later, however, Lysithea was in his arms and held protectively against his chest as he clutched his small, spiky friend tightly, like she would dissolve into starlight the moment he let go, just like the white dragons. He heard a lot of panicky, horrified yelling all around him. Seconds later Hilda crashed into them, joining the hug, followed by Mary Ann, then Raphael. Annette crowded over at his side, grabbing at Lysithea's hand with tears in her eyes. Over Lysithea's head, he could see Byleth standing up, her hands clenched into fists with a mixture of fury, grief, and terror in her eyes. Arg, stop it, please. Lysithea flailed as much as she was able in their grip. Don't cry, for the love of Suthies. She squirmed to look up at him, and Claude thought he might have seen her mouth drop open in shock. He wasn't certain, because his vision was strangely blurry. The smoke from the bonfire must be bothering him. The painful lump in his throat, and the thousands of needles he felt in his heart at the thought of his friend crumbling into dust before she'd really been able to live. That was everyone, Lysithea mumbled, the fight that had always been in her voice draining out all at once. Please don't cry. She lowered her head onto Hilda's shoulder. The pinkette was ignoring her request, shaking and sobbing while clinging to her like she was a china doll that would shatter on the ground. Claude brushed her soft silver hair with one hand as he fought to control his breathing, blink his vision clear. His throat constricted tightly as he battled with images of her in a sarcophagus, of her being denied a happy ending and a happy life even if they won and burned Shamhala to the ground. I don't have enough friends to lose one this way so soon. Agartha did this. Thales did this. A wave of cold washed over him, clearing his mind in one crystal moment. They're going to fix you, he announced with a strangely flat voice. What? Lysithea asked, turning to look at him again and staring blankly. They're going to fix you, he repeated firmly, letting go of her and stepping back so he could clench his fists without squeezing her too tight. We're going to find the doctors of Shamhala and they're going to fix you. You can't promise that, Lysithea protested meekly. Meekly? The cold intensified to a degree that he had felt at Hrym. Of course we can. Atra interjected heatedly. Lysithea spun around to face her, the renegade Agartha, and calmly slammed one fist into an open hand, her expression livid and fierce as an angry wyvern. I know the medical stations of Shamhala, Lysithea. I was learning to be a field medic. I know where everything of ascending importance is kept and who knows their way around it. When we're taking Shamhala from Thales, we'll go off to the side, chase those bastards down, nail them to the wall, and make it very clear that if they don't fix what they did to you, there are going to be consequences. Yes, that. Hilda babbled, bouncing back and looking wildly at Flayn. Flayn could take care of you until then, her divine prerogative is healing. Right, Sethleen? You can help her. I will do everything I can, Flayn promised, a frightfully determined look on her face. I refuse to let those terrible people take any more of my friends away. Lysithea's eyes grew suspiciously wet. You guys, I should have expected you to be so stubborn. Look, I brought this up because I had something to tell you about the dragons. Alright. Lysithea. Ria's voice cut the short mage off. She blinked rapidly to suddenly find herself facing the saint who defeated Nemesis, who, upon ensuring that she had her full attention, knelt down before her. I'm sorry, the woman said with a faint tremor in her voice, anger or sadness or both. He was leaning towards both. She didn't let it overwhelm the words. I failed you and your family so completely, I don't deserve to be in your presence. What? What in the world are you talking about? Lysithea stammered in protest, her eyes widening to deer in wyvern crosshairs degree. You had no legal authority over Ionius. No, but I could have intervened on your behalf, and far more importantly, I've known about Agartha my whole life. I've done terrible things in the name of keeping them from having power over humanity again, and I've watched them for any sign of stirring. Yet I became foolish and caught up in my own desires, and I allowed this to happen to you and your family right underneath my nose. Ria lowered her head until her forehead was pressed against Lysithea's shoes, a gesture of complete humility and penance. I claimed it as my duty to protect the people of Fodlan, but I allowed myself to lose my way. If I had been truly, properly vigilant, this would not have happened. I insist you raise this grievance against me after the war, so your parents might be awarded compensation to ensure their continued comfort. Lysithea seemed completely at loss for words. I am sorry as well, Seath said, bowing to her. You were under my care while at the officers' academy, yet neither Manuela nor myself ever realized how severely compromised your health was. I was hiding it. Lysithea squeaked, desperately putting her hands on Ria's shoulders and pulling, trying to get her to stand up again. As the older woman did so, she shook her head and managed anyway. I was going somewhere with this wasn't the thing I was trying to get to. Atra, you said that Thales must want Edelgard for a purpose. Marion said that she had been given the crest of the flames. I know you initially wrote that off, but I think it's true. I think I know why he needs her, because she's just like me. Sylvain choked. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. When we were fighting her? Yes. That's what she was alluding to when she implied I should have joined her in prosecuting her bloody war of conquest. Lysithea snorted. Seeing Justine, how she was crippled, and her hair, that just confirmed it. I guess since they had a previous test run to tweak the procedure, some of them would have survived. She sighed heavily, suddenly looking quite old. Byleth hugged her tightly, which Lysithea only half-heartedly tried to escape before giving up and resting in her protective embrace. The Hresvelg children were never sick. They were being designed as dragons and weapons against you, the Nabateans. Edelgard was the only one who both survived and could perform the task, and at some point she convinced herself that this power would give her the strength to kill you and Thales and claim the continent for herself. Someday, Claude thought through the haze of rage in his mind, I'm going to learn something from history that won't leave me wanting to kill a whole lot of people. Someday. After I pay Thales back for all the pain he's inflicted on the people precious to me. Chapter 79. They were leaving Ferdinand, Caspar, who finally woke from his medical coma under Flane's supervision, Shamir, and Judith along with some troops behind in Inber to stabilize the temporary government and ensure they held the land until such time as they could return and figure out what the fuck they were going to do with it. The victorious United Army, the army of the Crusaders, the people of Adrestia had been calling them, was now on a march back over the bridge to Gareg Mach Monastery. And all Byleth wanted to do was lie down and die. Well, maybe not die. Lie down and take a 500-year nap was more accurate, but her emotional state was screaming that it wanted to die, drowning out both her cool logic and her common sense, so it tended to get the first word in. I just want to close my eyes and not see blood and corpses behind them. I just want to go back to Gareg Mach and declare the war over. I just want to stop sending people into battles some of them won't come out of. I want to stop washing blood off my hands. I want to be done with this. Suthisa's presence wreathed around her like a warm robe, pulsing with concern and some guilt. I think I can put you to sleep. It would be wise, you're burnt out, Byleth. I have to keep one eye on the Agarthan kids, Byleth thought back wanly, leaning into the goddess's warmth. I'm not mad at you, by the way. That doesn't mean I can't be sorry, I didn't even think that my anger could hurt you. Well, I wasn't thinking of much of anything in the moment, but still. It's okay. I wasn't any better after my father. A familiar pang of grief hit her chest, not as strong as it once was, but harsh and tangible nonetheless. Are you sure you don't want to go to sleep and let me watch the children? I appreciate it, but they'd be terrified of you. Atra was scared, literally speechless when she first saw you, and she has more discipline than Marian and the other children. Byleth couldn't help a tiny half-smile, because she could feel Suthis pouting at her. I'll lead them into it, I promise. Humph. I'm too grateful that you're finally delegating responsibilities to tease you over how much you worry. Hee, somehow, I feel a little bit better. Dimitri's fingers ran through her hair, gentle and sweet as ever. Byleth cracked one eye halfway open and looked across to the wagon directly across in front of theirs. Marian was leaning against the bars of the prison separating them, Emil visible behind her, his head tilted to indicate he was listening to. The former Death Knight looked like he was half asleep. His other self had made an appearance in the night, and while no one got hurt, he just caused one hell of a scare, and the Agarthan kids clearly weren't fazed given that one of them was asleep in his lap. What did it say about them that the Death Knight persona wasn't enough to put fear of death into Thales's little soldiers? He was clearly drained by it. Other kids were leaning against the bars, listening intently. She was pretty sure the redhead and the brunette were Sophia and Daniel, but she was tired enough that she might have them mixed up with the others. Daniel was the kid who'd tried to. She chased the thought away before she could finish it, but not in time to prevent a whole new wave of melancholy and distress to wash over her. Dead children, dead parents, dead friends, rivers of blood irrigating cobblestone roads and tinting rivers rusted pink, screaming and metal rending and bones crackling under pressure, and it was all routine. When had that become routine? When had that become her whole world? Claude's hand settled on top of hers and squeezed gently. Byleth exhaled slowly, then tried to say that she was all right, except all that came out was incoherent mumbling. She felt Dimitri tense up just a little bit, and his hand slid down to her shoulder and massaged it gently without stopping his storytelling. Her head hurt. Her chest hurt. And it wasn't any physical or spiritual pain, she hadn't managed to burn herself into the red despite the four elites' presence, thank you, Rhea, Indek, and Suthisa's rage-induced body jacking, while a terrible shock to the system, hadn't done any serious damage. Even after finally losing her temper after one horrific revelation and crime against her family too many, Suthis had been careful not to break her. No. Intellectually, some things were left over from her emotionally frozen ashen demon state, she knew it was burnout. Her father had talked about it on several occasions, it was the main reason that he spaced out their missions, hoarded their money to ensure they could drift through weeks or even months without serious work. Even if you win every battle you fought every day, the war will grind you down until nothing's left. You have to step away from it, every now and then, so you don't forget the taste of food and the warmth of peace. She knew it intellectually. Emotionally was a whole different boat. By this point Byleth had heard all the mom jokes, the teasing, and comments to the tune of mother and murder. She preferred them to the uneasy murmurs that stalked her as the ashen demon, but she'd still been baffled by it all. How could anyone look around at the people they cared about, that you loved, knowing you were going to war, and not throw themselves wholly at the uphill battle of keeping them as safe as possible? She was so afraid of losing them, losing her family, that it was enough to keep her up at night back when she had just been a professor. Why couldn't she have just stayed a professor then become a wife? Why did she have to become a warlord? Why did she have to step into her older sister's shoes? Why all of this? Why Edelgard? Why? Then she became archbishop. Then there were, all these people, that she had to look after. That she cared about, even if it was to a lesser extent than her precious ones. And even though they volunteered, even though they hadn't taken the offer to step out whenever she'd offered it, she still had to send them into battles not all of them would come out of. Because she wasn't a goddess, despite having Suthisa's heart, no, she was only semi-divine, still mortal. Her powers could only go so far, she could only save so many people. She'd felt the pain tugging at her. Now that she was actually thinking about it, she'd felt it on Murden Bridge when they'd been ambushed, and they had to hastily bury over 100 people before pushing into Adrescha's lands. But she'd pushed it back, squared it away so she could support her loved ones and her knights and help them through to the other end of this nightmare. And now it was over, except it wasn't over, because Edelgard had never been the conductor of this tragedy, had never been the head of the snake. She'd just been wicked girl who would rather drag all of Fodlan down into the burning flames than let her beliefs go unrealized or her pain go unanswered. She'd drawn enough blood from Fodlan to make Lake Totates run red, and all for what? To blind everyone to their mutual enemy, to leave them limping and bleeding for when the eldest empire literally crawled out of its grave to devour them. Byleth squeezed her eyes shut, listening to Suthisa's humming soothingly and burrowing deeper into her spiritual warmth. Isn't this ironic? I've won, we've conquered Adrescha and saved Faergus and Leicester, saved the people of Adrescha from becoming cattle, and I don't want to celebrate. I just want to cry, to scream, and scream until my lungs give out, to put out my eyes so I no longer see blood and corpses every time I close them. I want it to be done and over. I want to hand this responsibility right back to Sirios, hide away and sleep for years. She knew Dimitri felt something like this, but his sense of duty was stronger than mountain stone. It was giving him a buffer from the worst of his grief and guilt and remorse. Claude felt it too. His heart was gentle, far gentler than he gave himself credit for, and the three of them would probably hide away and cry for a long time once they got back to Gareg Mach. Well, not for a long time. Just for however long they had the chance to before they had to join Atra and the others to strategize their assault on Shamhala. The last stage of the war. The real war, finally stepping out of the shadows and into the light of day. I'm so fucking tired. I know, Suthis murmured. I know. I promise, you'll be able to rest soon. Byleth might have nodded faintly. She felt Dimitri brush her hair away from her eyes as she began to drift again. It didn't feel like a proper, slowly, then all at once, sleep. It was more like drifting underwater, being close enough to the surface as to be sort of aware that something was going on up there but too far under to make any sense of it. But bad sleep was a sight better than no sleep at all, so Byleth didn't twitch when, some indeterminate time later, she felt herself being shifted and then a blanket being thrown over her. That sense of movement stopped as well, which was fine with her, because every time the wagon jolted over a rock in the road she was almost dragged back to wakefulness, which she did not appreciate. There was a lot of indistinct talking in the distance. Byleth burrowed deeper under the woolly blanket, grumbling as she tried to escape back onto the field. Her head hurt a bit, much less than earlier, but still noticeable since she wasn't exactly sleeping evenly. No dice, she wasn't quite sleeping, just dozing. She also had the odd sense that someone was staring intently at her. Suthies wasn't agitating for her to get up, so it wasn't an enemy, but the tangible sense of being watched was prickling at her. Ind of odd, and she. Not mean, I know, he's nice. Makes sense. Ot the hair, dragon. Half and ha, change her. Like that. Earthshaker, gave M. Odes, can't say. But I. Byleth twitched a bit, her murky mind slowly noting that those voices belonged to the gaggle of Agartha and child soldiers. They were discussing her, and fairly animatedly at that. She debated shaking off the dozing state she was in, sitting up, and intruding. But as her mind slowly rebooted, she decided instead to fake sleep and listen in. She would probably get a more honest look into their minds that way than if she was awake. The kids were willing to tolerate her presence, though that was it so far. Mercedes was the person they seemed to genuinely like without reservation. Nevertheless, she did want to know what they were thinking. Expected someone to come spring us, but that's not going to happen, is it? Daniel asked morosely. We'll be listed as missing in action by now. It'll be okay, a boy whose name she didn't know said encouragingly. Once Chancellor Thales wins the war, people are bound to find us, and we'll go home like nothing happened. I mean, if Mercy's bosses were going to kill us, they would have done so already, right? Mercy won't let them kill us, another boy, Gabriel? Interjected with a note of confidence. We just have to bunker down and wait it out. It's true, but, I'm not sure Sophia started, sounding a little troubled. I mean, Mercy will be on the front lines, tending to wounded. I don't want anything bad to happen to her. Uneasy silence followed that remark. No one, Byleth noticed, attempted to reassure Sophia that Mercedes was a healer and thus wouldn't be targeted under the rules of war unless she actively participated in the fighting. Then, we'll just convince her to stay behind. Marion interjected, sounding a little shaken. She's smart, she'll know it's not a fight she can win. But then all her friends will go without her, and be killed. That will make her really sad, Sophia pointed out. Marion let out a small keening noise, like she wanted to object but found that she couldn't. An uneasy silence fell over the children as they pondered this, the chattering of the army not far away forming a haze of background noise against the forest. And what about Emil? Sophia added uncertainly. Won't he get noted as a raging feral and, disposed of? Raw unhappiness washed over her voice as she said that. But his mind is sick. That's not the same as being feral. Gabriel protested. We can explain that, can't we? We're low-ranked, Daniel pointed out solemnly. We can be overruled, no matter how well we argue our case. Byleth twitched a bit, wondering if this was a moment to interject. She could possibly build on the uncertainty they all felt right now, but they might well respond aggressively to any attempt to sway them in the face of this confusion. So she lay still, continuing to listen while cracking one eye open slightly. I'm going to kill Thales, Suthies hissed lowly, her anger bubbled beneath Byleth's skin, low-key but intensely hot. They're children, they shouldn't be confused by the fact they're valuing another human's life. I don't think we can execute him 3 times, but we can damn well try, Byleth thought back darkly. Marion? Do you think that maybe we don't have to fight them? Sophia asked tentatively. What do you mean? You know the answer to that. Marion said, and Byleth grinned when she noticed that the girl didn't sound nearly so confident as the first time they'd met. We have to trust the Chancellor and the Senators, they are our heroes, the ones who sacrificed so much to bring us back, to take the surface back for us. I know everyone's always said that, but, maybe after the centuries, something changed. Sophia hinged. I mean, they didn't even know what dragon's blood was until Atra of the Surface told them. If they didn't know about that, maybe they didn't know about us? How can you hate a person you've never met? If they kill your mother? Easily. Daniel muttered bitterly. Sophia didn't seem to have heard him, however. And, you know, she wasn't nearly as scary as I thought she'd be. I thought she'd be an 8-foot monster who drank blood and breathed fire, but she's so normal. So she's not completely crazy, good for her. What about our families? What about Shamhala? Do you want them to stay trapped down in the dark forever? We have to win this, or else. Chains clinked and several rough smacking sounds caused Byleth a little concern. Judging by the lack of yelps, Marian was hitting herself, but still. Grandma's going to die in the dark and the cold if we can't win. I can't let that happen. Sophia let out an unhappy noise, slumping. Daddy, she whimpered. I want to see Daddy again. I want him to see the sunlight. It's so beautiful up here, isn't it? Yeah. Daniel murmured. I feel like I could stare at the sky all day. I want to see the ocean. Marian complained, sounding a hair saner than a moment ago. I wasted months babysitting that stupid puppet emperor when I could have had a post near the beaches. You still would have gotten captured, Daniel noted mildly. This army took the ports, remember? Marian muttered something incoherent, followed by a startled noise. The kids quieted down. Puzzled, Byleth shifted in preparation to get up and was startled to feel a soft touch on top of her head. What is it? She asked blearily, sitting up and letting the heavy blanket slid down to her hips as she blinked at the figure trying to get her attention. Justine von Hresvelg smiled shyly at her before offering her a plate with 2 sandwiches on it. You missed lunch, Professor, Ash said warmly, one hand resting lightly on a handle of the young princess's hovering chair. You must be starving, with how hard you've been working. Oh, her stomach rumbled loudly at the smell of good food. Blushing lightly, Byleth accepted the plate and balanced it carefully on her knees. Thank you, both of you. How are you feeling, princess? Justine tilted her head, then pulled out what looked like a smooth gray tablet from the side of her chair. She tapped a finger against it and it lit up with a strange blue light, then removed a long black stick from within the tablet. Byleth blinked again to clear her vision further, and watched as Justine moved the pen along the tablet for a minute or two, then picked the tablet up and turned it around so she could see it. I'm not uncomfortable at all now, thank you. Miss Flane was able to fix me a little so my chronic pain went away. You don't have to call me princess, I can't and don't want to rule. Wow, Byleth said, unable to suppress her surprise and awe. It's interesting, isn't it? Ash said excitedly. It's another bit of Agartha's magical technology. They have a lot of designs that make the people's lives easier and more comfortable. Atraz mentioned a few in passing, but it's different to see them. It makes it more real. I can see that, Byleth mused. I'm glad to hear you aren't hurting anymore, Justine. Did Flane say anything about giving you your legs back? Justine frowned a bit. She tapped another button and started scribbling again. She and Miss Martinez both had a look at me. The big problem is that my bones have reset around the damage that the procedure the word procedure was shaky and nearly illegible, so it would be difficult to make significant progress in fixing it, not to mention my dead nerves. But she could fix what was causing me pain, and that's enough for me right now. I see. I'm sorry we couldn't do more for you. Justine shook her head and wrote a bit. I'm so happy to get away from those monsters. I don't care if I never walk as long as I'm never at their mercy again. Byleth nodded in understanding. You never will be. I promise. Internally, she grimaced at the realization that Edelgard had kept Justine in the palace where Thales had been. If Lysithea was right, and she was subjected to the same procedure as her and her siblings, how she could leave her crippled sister within arm's length of the man responsible, Byleth simply could not fathom. Justine smiled gratefully. Oh man, Marian was leaning up against the iron bars again, peering through them toward Justine. What is it? Ash asked her, gripping the back of the chair again as the young girl stiffened at the sight of the Agarthan kids. The hair, the chair, your augmentation failed, didn't it? Marian said. Contrary to Byleth's expectations, she actually sounded sympathetic, wincing. That really sucks. Nerve damage surgery costs an arm, a leg, and lifetime savings. Augmentation. Ash repeated uneasily, his brow furrowing. Don't tell me you were put under those awful crest implantation treatments as well. No, I wasn't given dragon's blood, I was given general physical enhancement. Marion said by way of explanation. It's a procedure that was learned from studying dragon's blood and genetic editing. Everyone who enters the army is subject to it after you pass initiation. It gives you peak human physical or magical performance depending on your proficiency. She shook her head. The procedures aren't perfect though, sometimes the body rejects it. Counselor Myson says it's a gene thing, Sophia said, shifting uncertainly. If you have a weak constitution, it's more likely to fail. Atra told me that she was sent to commit the Dusker massacre at 13, Byleth started slowly, a familiar bubbling rage beginning to rise in her chest. When is initiation? 12, after 3 years of boot camp. Marion responded, her tone as matter-of-fact as if she was saying that water was wet. That was rather at odds with how Daniel stiffened, Sophia shuddered, and Marion herself shrank in on herself reflexively. Why do you want to know? That's horrible, Ash said in dismay while Byleth choked down both her unending rage and Suthisa's as well. How could they put children through a potentially fatal surgery and send them out as soldiers immediately afterward? What do you mean, why? Marion said slowly, equal parts indigent yet confused. Isn't it our duty to serve and protect our homelands? That's why you're carrying that thing, you're not that much older than me. That's true, but I'm old enough to legally squire, and the situation demanded it. Ash protested, shaking his head vehemently. If Faergus's situation had not been critically short when Emperor Edelgard declared war, I would have been sent home. Children should be protected from war, not forced to fight in it. We're not being forced, Marion insisted. I'm doing this for my grandmother, she's too old and weak to fight. It pays well and I'll be able to take her to the surface, get her out of the cramped lower quarter we live in. You shouldn't have to do this to provide for her, Ash said sadly. The church provides room and board for orphans and the infirm, free of charge or class restrictions. Does Shamhala really have no equivalent of that? Marion, Sophia, and Daniel's response to that? Confused, uncomprehending staring. Byleth bit down on her first 3 reactions to that and returned her attention to the highly nervous-looking Justine. It was a sign of how bad her trauma was that even Agartha and children, soldier or not, they were children, who were stuck in a prison wagon, frightened her simply by being nearby. Where's Lucy? She's usually at your side, she asked. Justine looked a little relieved and quickly returned her attention to her tablet. Getting some food, and talking to Atra. They both looked super serious. I think they're talking about Shamhala's internal systems. So I thought I'd find something else to do, and I heard you hadn't eaten yet. Yeah, that sounded about right. Atra was their single greatest asset for the war to come, probably second only to Byleth herself. She knew how to get to Shamhala and what was awaiting them within. She was their guiding light, and even more critically, their best hope of convincing the civilians within that they were not here to slaughter them, to surrender without harming themselves. Lucy could fill a similar role if she was willing to get into the thick of things, but she was probably better served staying back at the medical stations. Might I tell you a story about the cataclysm, and what happened afterward? Byleth offered, deciding to take the plunge. She felt several pairs of young eyes fixating on her, perhaps Emil as well. She might have just heard him stirring, but didn't move her attention from Justine. I heard it from the goddess and saint in deck. Justine blinked a few times, then looked very curious. Edelgard shared the Hresvelg secret history with me, but it sounded all wrong. It was too much like what that man said to be true. Is there actually a hidden history? Yes, but it was hidden for good reason. It all began with the javelins of light. Byleth picked up one of her sandwiches, biting into it before starting the story with the missiles that destroyed the world. She heard Marion make an incomprehensible half-screech, but didn't let her interrupt. Listen to the story until it's finished, please. Listen and learn the truth. Let me exorcise the demons of old Agartha from you before they drag you into their graves. It took them ages to get back to the monastery. Not that Byleth was really aware of that, since she slept through most of it. Marianne, Ash, and Seath were dropped off in Edmund territory to find Maurice and inform him that the storming of Shamhala was coming soon, and to wait for them near the entrance to Shamhala. She rather hoped he didn't scare the Goneril people silly as he moved through their territory. The higher their morale was for this nightmare, the better. They would link back up with them there. Everyone else, all the troops who could be spared from Faergus and Laiskter and Almira and any Adrestian troops they could trust would be traveling to Garreg Mach for the biggest mustering in Fodlan's history. Many were already on their way. Ferdinand had promised that he would send everyone he knew was loyal to him up their way as soon as he got things in the country somewhat under control. Meaning they could be too late, but they would just have to manage without them if that was the case. They had to give themselves time to plan, but they also couldn't allow Thales time to properly prepare for war with them. They had to strike while Agartha was still in disarray from the pounding they took in Adrestia. Once they got back to the monastery and squared everyone away, Rhea would take her and Indek off to the Serang desert where Mikul had made his home, and hopefully Suthies would guilt/browbeat him into helping them. They would have to push it to get there and back as quickly as possible, because they needed all the time in the world to strategize before they began their march. And they needed to plan around all 10 of the Elitsug. Yes, they had the Saints on their side, and at least 4 of the Einherjar seemed to be of the mind to let them win, but still. Byleth was not looking forward to this in the slightest. Hey! Hey, Professor, look, look! Hilda shook her violently, rousing her from her nap against Dimitri's side. She grumbled in protest and raised her head to scowl at the beaming Pinkette. It's Garreg Mach. We're finally back. That blew her sleepiness away in an instant. Byleth whirled around and followed her friend's pointing finger. Sure enough, they were in an achingly familiar bit of woods that lead out to warm open plains. A bright, fuzzy pool of happiness filled her chest. Grinning, Byleth climbed straight out of the cart and darted ahead of their guards to much laughter and confused, startled protests. She ran out from under tree cover out into the open hills, her eyes immediately clapping onto the looming castle across from her. I'm back home, Byleth thought happily, mentally tugging on Suthies' arm in an attempt to express the sheer joy and relief rushing through her. Suthies, I'm home. We're home. Indeed we are, Suthies sent back fondly. Then she tilted her head curiously. It seems we aren't the first to arrive. Correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't those Almiran wyverns? Byleth blinked, and finally moved her attention from the monastery itself to the fields directly in front of it. Sure enough, there were hundreds of tents pitched outside, all bright and colorful in a distantly familiar way from her travels in the country. Wyverns were flying overhead, their riders brawling it out in a lazy sparring match. I wasn't expecting so many to come, she said aloud, a little breathless and impressed. I know Claude called this the war for the fate of the world, but this is still Fodlan. Their queen is here, Suthies noted. I imagine those who had reservations felt that if she was going, it would be dishonorable and disloyal of them to stay behind. Oh, shoot. I can't believe I almost forgot, she is here, isn't she? Nervous to meet the parents? Suthies teased. If one parent is famously known, even in Fodlan, as the Demon Queen, I'm perfectly justified in being nervous, thank you very much. Byleth protested. Odd to hear coming from you, Miss Ashen Demon. Less snarking, more advice, please. Is that Almira? Dimitri's voice startled her out of her reverie. He'd appeared at her side in the few seconds she spent gazing out at her home. I don't recognize those colors, and they're all stationed outside the monastery. That's definitely Almira, Byleth giggled, glancing at him. Are you ready to meet the Demon Queen? Dimitri eyed the landscape with no small amount of apprehension. Aha, they really call Claude's mother that. Oh yes. Ivory trilled overhead, Claude flew over them, putting on some speed from the leisurely pace he'd been taking up until that point. Byleth nudged Dimitri, murmured come on, and ran after her prince with him at her heels. As they approached, a horse that had been standing stationary near one of the dark circles of Almiran soldiers broke away and darted across the fields like an arrow toward them. Ivory began to fly down low as the horse and rider approached. Byleth slowed to a light jog as the beautiful wyvern came in for a landing. Khalid slid off her back, his expression bright with joy as the horse came up to them at full speed only to expertly come to a halt 3 yards away. Queen Tiana von Regan swung down from her loyal horse in one move, brushing her long braid of golden brown hair back over her shoulder as she approached. She wasn't a hugely tall woman, being 2 inches shorter than Byleth herself. Of course Byleth's 6'1" frame was hardly in the norm, but she radiated power and intimidation from every inch of her muscular figure and piercing green eyes. An elegant silver bow was slung over her shoulder, her fingers well worn with callus from a lifetime of using the bow. She wasn't very old, mid to late 30s, thanks to leaving Lester young to escape her arranged marriage and chase after her true love. "Mom," Khalid said, his voice equal parts happiness and nervousness as Tiana stopped 2 arms lengths away from them and crossed her arms, giving him a look. Dmitri hesitantly took Ivory's reins from him, standing partly behind Byleth in a bid to stay out of this initial conversation. Suthies above, I've missed you so damn much." He frantically rubbed at his eyes to hide his tears. "I've missed you too," Tiana said lightly, though the faintest edge of forbidding in her tone that made the hairs on the back of Byleth's neck stand up. "I've missed you so much that I had a heart attack when certain letters finally ended up on my desk." She started to speak falsetto. "Yes, mother, Adrestia has declared war on the rest of Fodlan after several assassination attempts on my person failed, and an ancient death cult is providing them monsters and curses straight out of your nightmares. But don't worry, you'll find out about it a month and a half after it started. I'm so confident that I don't think I need to tell you anything until I come to realize the world is at stake." Khalid gulped audibly. "That wasn't intentional, I swear. The Empire was marching on the monastery, so there was no way I could get a message to you right after it got started. Of course. You could only just get a message about the death cult to Father before the war was declared proper. You couldn't possibly add an extra one for the maids to pass on to your poor bereft mother and father like you have been ever since your schooling started." "I was panicking. I've been in panic mode for over 5 months. Khalid cried, throwing his hands in the air. "You know what they've been calling me? The Master Tactician. That's what they've bloody well gone and stuck me with. I had to spend practically every waking second making sure I wouldn't fail and bring the entire bloody army down with me." "And did you seriously just use the word?" He was so panicked he dropped right back into his native language, babbling a string of protests and pleading that Tiana took in with an arched eyebrow. He was speaking quickly enough that Byleth could barely keep track of what he was saying despite being fairly fluent in the tongue. "Losing my mind, I'm sorry and I love you," Khalid pleaded when he finally ran out of breath, eyes wide and shiny as he stared at her. Tiana's eyes softened, then she rolled them fondly before stepping forward and wrapping her son in a crushing embrace. "I love you too, silly boy," she whispered tenderly, pressing a kiss on the top of his head. "And I am more proud of you than I can ever say." Claude buried his head in her shoulder, a shuddering sob escaping his throat as he hid in her arms like a child. It was so strong and harsh it was as if he was venting out all his feelings in that single sound. Tiana patted him on the back, humming an unfamiliar tune as she comforted him and more than likely reassured herself that he was safe and relatively unharmed. "Thanks, Mom." Tiana ruffled his hair. "Your father is still at home, unfortunately. He might join us later, but some of the lords are holding out and he has to slap them into submission. Pops will have an aneurysm if he misses the fight for the fate of the world because of a few xenophobic princes," Claude laughed shakily. "That he will," Tiana noted in amusement. "That's why I feel safe saying he'll probably show up at Holst's doorstep before the war proper starts." "Sounds like King Kira," Byleth murmured. She was a little surprised by the words. She'd seen him at least once in person, but why was she so sure of that? Tiana looked up and examined her with a thoughtful gaze. Byleth resisted the urge to twitch as the Demon Queen released her son and stepped over to her, green eyes sharp and feeling like pools of light peering directly into her soul. "So these are Byleth and Dmitri," she murmured. Her eyes settled on Dmitri, and Byleth heard her muted but sharp intake of breath. "My lady," Dmitri said shyly, shifting from one foot to the other and nervously meeting her eyes. Tiana breathed out slowly, awestruck, as she reached out and touched the side of the young king's face. "You look so much like Lambert," she murmured. "You have Amelia's cheekbones, but the rest, it's all him." "I've heard that a lot," Dmitri managed, blinking a few times. "Amelia, you knew my mother too." "Only in passing, unfortunately. She was a year beneath myself, Lambert and Rodrigue, a gentle soul, though she could be stern when she put her foot down despite how frail she was." Tiana examined him for another second, then pulled Dmitri into a tight hug. "I'm so sorry, little Mitya. He deserved better than what happened that night." "You both did." "Thank you," Dmitri said softly, his tone wavering a bit as he repressed tears. Tiana gently patted the back of his head and released him a moment later, giving him a sad little half-smile before glancing over at Byleth. "I wasn't sure I'd ever see you again, little fox," she remarked. "I wasn't sure until Khalid mentioned Geralt, but then I knew. Kira was confident you'd continue right on being a warrior, even though Nader had never seen anyone bounce back from that much dark magic." Byleth jumped. "Ah, have we met?" "We did, but you didn't forget. It was bleached right out of your mind." Tiana grinned a little, which made her look like a fox. "I'll tell you about it until Rodrigue finally catches up. He's still slow as ever, I see. He better have his brats with him. I've wanted to meet them for years now." Chapter 80, Interlude. All the days blurred together. If her mind registered any sense of time passing, it was blurred out through the pain and the drugs. Edelgard had been pulled from the throne room, still blistered, burned and broken from that bolting, and bodily flung into a cage. She knew this mostly because of the painful bruises on her back that radiated harshly whenever she moved. She didn't remember it, however. She blacked out mid-warp from the pain and fell deep into unconsciousness. The first time she resurfaced, she found herself in a cage. Instinctively she tried to get up, to assess the situation, to call for Hubert, her most loyal, who'd never failed to be at her side except for the moments the universe conspired against him. A wave of vertigo more powerful than anything she'd ever experienced left her prostrate on the ground, vomiting noisily. No. Not the ground. On hard metal. A metallic ringing noise echoed in her ears as she blearily looked about. Her eyes refused to fully focus. There was a watery feeling in her head as she moved, that seemed like water being sloshed about in a bowl. Across from her were iron bars, beyond them, indistinct dark figures striding to and fro. Indistinct shouting and the nickering of horses followed them wherever they went. The greens, browns, and blacks in the background told her they were in some sort of forest. "Cage, I'm in another cage." She tried to sit up, her stomach roiling, and immediately regretted it when a vile smell threatened to suffocate her and disgusting warm liquid hit her chin and dribbled down her neck, around the thing on her head. Why can't I move?" Edelgard tried to feel around her with her arms, but more than the slightest of movements was sharply arrested. Looking down, she saw heavy black shackles covering the length of her arms up to her elbows, all but pinning them together. Trying to move her legs yielded no better results. Rezu, a disrepair. Kantai, success. No. Iratai, 2 and 3, survive. How is possible? He blazin, hell. No pursuit. Diverted. Ast they, re good for someth. Edelgard squinted, fighting to make her vision focus. Hubert. Where was Hubert? He hadn't been far away. She knew he'd been performing a fighting retreat. He'd never let them escape with her without a fight. He had to be here somewhere. She just had to find him, be ready to escape. Find out what happened in the capital. Her second attempt to get up went no better than the first. Her vision went completely white and she found herself flat on her face again, dry heaving and coughing up bile. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a swirl of grimoire robes. A vaguely familiar figure had stepped in front of the cage and got the attention of one of the dark figures, pointing meaningfully at her while saying something she couldn't understand. She heard laughter, then a genial, do what you want, sort of gesture from the person the grimoire had been talking to. Her vision was obstructed. She tried to open her mouth to demand an explanation only to find that she could barely open her jaws. Something hard and cold was almost pinning them together. As her vision swirled, she realized that her peripherals were obstructed by cold gray steel. There was a cage upon her head. Then something sharp struck her in the back of the neck, a tiny arrow? A needle? And darkness consumed her again. Her back still ached terribly when she woke again, but her vision was a bit clearer. They were still in a forest somewhere, but she didn't recognize it. Granted, she didn't know all the forests in her territory, but a deeply sinking feeling told her that she was out of Adrestia. As she tried to sit up, her wrists and ankles screamed in protest. Her skin was being rubbed raw at the least. It was probably worse, but she couldn't see beneath the metal. Her head was still fuzzy. When she tried to concentrate, nausea racked her entire body and nearly sent her tumbling back into unconsciousness. There was more talking outside. It was dark out, and she couldn't see much beyond the trees around her cage. Her clothes were filthy, and her cage hadn't been cleaned since she last regained consciousness. A bonfire burned in the ground a few dozen yards away from her, which the guards of the camp were sitting around warily fiddling with their weapons. To go around to avoid the great beast, one youngish-sounding man said uneasily. Else we'll have to let the dragon slayer out to deal with him. You're not seriously suggesting letting that little bitch out of her chains again? One of his fellows scathed. That imbecilic mutt we made the earth-shattering mistake of blessing with the fell star's blood will just do the stupidest thing that enters her tiny little brain and get more of us killed. We'd be better off fighting the great beast with sticks than following her lead in a battle. Isn't that the truth? Another one grumbled. We should have given up her empire as a bad job a long time ago. Talk about the blind leading the blind. Are you saying you don't trust Counselor Thales's judgment? What? No, of course not. That's not what I mean at all. I'm just frustrated that the two mutts caused us to lose so many more people than we bargained for to the bloody Fellstar and her two loyal subordinates. We didn't do as much damage as the war was meant to, didn't we? An unhappy silence fell over the group. Edelgard snorted, she couldn't help herself, and one of them whipped around and pinned her with a furious look. Did I say something funny, mutt? He hissed, rising from the log he had been sitting on. Don't think I don't know about how your dog manufactured my cousin's death on the island kingdom. I haven't paid you back for that yet. He snapped his fingers, dark magic crackling around them. Hey, be careful, Matt, the counselors still need her alive, one of his friends cautioned. I haven't forgotten, Matt responded frigidly as the magic tendrils of death swirled around his fingers. She'll live. For now. Edelgard tried to get out of the way, but her chained legs hampered her, and there wasn't anywhere for her to hide in the cage. The magic struck her head on, burning her skin and rattling her bones. She couldn't scream with how her jaw was pinned, but it wasn't for lack of trying. When she woke up the third time, her back screaming, blood dripping from beneath the shackles on her arms, but her head and vision were clear. As she took in her surroundings, she wasn't sure that was a good thing. It was a large box full of unnatural light blue light, not all that different from the mechanism that allowed travel down into the holy tomb in Gareg Mach. A hissing sound filled the air, and she felt the ground jerk and begin to slide downward. A clicking noise sounded every handful of seconds, red symbols appearing and then changing with every click. As she looked ahead, she saw a number of silver buttons embedded in the wall, blue light glowing from behind them, except for the 1 second from the very bottom, which was glowing red instead. Edelgard gave her head a shake and winced at the rattle of chains. The head muzzle was tighter than she remembered. She couldn't do much more than breath through slightly parted lips. She was sprawled on the floor, having at some point been removed from the cage and carelessly thrown over someone's shoulder. Her clothes were filthy. How long had they been traveling? Where was Hubert? Where were her father and Justine? Where was Casper? Where were her loyal people? They wouldn't let her be taken away like this. Feed her through a tube. I don't see why she has to keep wearing that now that we're here. Myson's voice drifted through the room. Edelgard blinked and squinted against the glare of that artificial blue to see Myson's side as the ever-glacially calm doctor tilted his head. What could it hurt? It will hurt me to have to listen to more of her whining and petulant demands after she botched the war so spectacularly we've had to retreat underground, Ode spit out. He was standing on his friend's right with his arms crossed. If she didn't have the Fellstar's crest, I'd say feed her to the demonic beasts. Our alliance with her wasn't just a miscalculation, it was an active detriment to our cause. Hindsight is 20/20, my friend, Thales sighed. There were other factors involved, of course. That boy Regan. Solon had spoken a number of times about inviting him into the truth, yet in the end he found it all by himself. From what I've learned from our spies that were able to get close to him from time to time, he created this alliance, he planned the attacks and counterattacks. He knew about our partnership with her before he even knew it was her behind the mask, not by yet another act of stupidity on her part, but solely through guile and extrapolating from what little that deserter was able to tell him. How? Odes asked after a moment, shocked. He's a surfacer, and a boy to boot. The people there are small of mind and duller of wit, falling for the most basic of frame-ups and carrot dangling. His father came from across the sea, Myson noted. We have precious few eyes that far away from Shambhala thanks to that thrice-cursed Sirios, perhaps more enlightened thinking survived over there without the beasts there to suffocate it. He sighed. How terrible, for such a brilliant mind to be enslaved to the fell star. To think of what he might have been able to do for humanity. Odes groaned. Thank you ever so much for finding a way for this to feel worse. He shook his head. The only thing odder than Regan's ability to corral the surfacers is Bladed's ability to inspire them. I looked at some of the Mutt's reports of desertion, and it's as if he only has to step into their presence and say a few kind words to them, and they drop to their knees to offer him their lives. The Fell Star's ability to do this, at least, can be chalked up to the worship she enjoys, but a boy racked with manic episodes and fits of trauma rage? It beggars belief. I am as at a loss for an explanation as you, Thales acknowledged. How could just a soft, gentle touch convince anyone he's a strong king? He shook his head. And yet all three of them would have been blind as bats had it not been for the blighted successor to Pan the traitor. Edelgard could feel the anger radiating off the two men at the mention of the girl, even without her name being spoken. How did you lose her, Odes? Thales asked calmly. Odes shook his head with a low snarl. As I told you, the last report I got about her location was that she was tending to a high-priority patient, and it came from her sister. It wasn't strange at all until she failed to return to base camp a week later, and even then it could easily be explained as having run afoul with what few survivors there were. Thales started to say something, but was cut off by the ringing of a bell. The large double doors hissed with steam as slid open on their own, revealing a long dim hallway lit by bright stones that glowed with yellow light. Standing in the hallway were two beautiful women in grimoire robes and a middle-aged man with a grim visage, along with a collection of what looked like mages and soldiers to serve as an honor guard. Welcome home, my brothers, one of the women said with a warm smile. Edelgard struggled to discern how old she was. Her skin was smooth, her shoulders and back straight, yet there were age wrinkles in her forehead and hands. I'm glad to see your return came without issue. Bias, my son said softly, striding across the room and embracing her, pressing a kiss against the top of her head. I've missed your company, and your sharp mind. I need you to examine my notes on the geese. I've made a few improvements, but it's not enough, and my eyes are sliding over potential possibilities. As they are wont to when you work so late into the night. Whatever would you do without me? Bias teased, brushing his dark hair behind his ear. Pitacus, can you mind the Ainherjar for me for a few days? My fiancé needs some assistance once again. Pitacus, who was more evidently young, her golden hair glittering like starlight in the dark as she pushed her long bangs out of her eyes. As you command, sensei. She bowed to Thales. We've received the Ainherjar and they're currently sleeping in the restricted medical wing. I've brought up the remaining cryostasis caskets, though the defrosting and awakening process has not begun yet as per your orders. How are the mortal men, Chancellor? There is a medical station ready and standing open, but if more are needed, I'll send word ahead and begin organizing. Please do, Thales said shortly, glaring down at Edelgard. Our retreat went mostly unnoticed, but due to certain factors we have more injured than I'd expected. Pitacus nodded sharply and immediately pulled a strange rectangular box out of her pocket. One thumb pressed the midway point and then flipped it open lengthwise. She rapidly tapped something on the new opening before striding back down the hall, raising the device to her ear and speaking authoritatively into it. Edelgard wasn't able to listen in. Odes yanked violently on the chain, throwing her forward and sending her crashing to the floor as her limbs attempted to react in ways restricted by her shackles. Get up, Mutt. He snarled, yanking her up halfway to her feet. If you make a nuisance of yourself for one instant longer, I swear I'll dislocate both your shoulders. Up. Edelgard tried to spit at him. It fell short, of course, since she could barely open her mouth. She saw Odes' eyes flare with the temper she'd seen in Maximus Varley and reached for her crests, pulling the chain free of his grip and attempted to whip it back into his face. A hand reached out and grabbed her about as sternly as Bladed's harsh grip. Edelgard's vision swung over to see the cold eyes of the middle-aged man, right before he smashed her arm into the wall not once but twice. She thought she might have felt the fracture the impact caused, but she wasn't given time to dwell on it. Odes' foot caught her in the stomach, the iron toes of his boot dug into her stomach, sending what little food she'd been given shooting up to her throat. Edelgard tried to grab his leg, but missed and the second blow hit her shoulder. It knocked her into the wall. Fiery lances of pain raked over her from her back as another foot blow caught her in the chest. She tried to stand up again only for that foot to hit her stomach again. She involuntarily puked, but with the head trap mostly holding her jaw shut, little could escape her mouth and she fell to the ground coughing and choking on it, forced to swallow it back down as a hand grabbed the cage and began slamming her into the wall. Her skull rattled, her vision went blank as one of her teeth was knocked loose on the next impact. Hunden! Odes raged as he savagely kicked her ribs and back. Nutzlos Hunden! Schwein! Inzuchtig Kreden! Odes, stop it! Meissen hissed harshly. Edelgard choked and swallowed desperately to clear her airway, tears of pain and panic blurring her vision as she twisted her head to look upward. She's a beaten prisoner. This reaction is beneath you. Odes let out a frustrated snarl, then dropped to one knee and roughly turned the helmet so she was forced to look at him. Your idiocy is only matched by your delusions of grandeur, he spat. Your mud is dead, rotting from the obsidian poison. Your palace burns. Your lands have been surrendered, some of them happily welcoming the Fellstar's army. There is no one left who is loyal to you, and there were precious few to begin with. You are nothing and no one, so cease your posturing and squawking and go to your cage with a little dignity. He bodily flung her into a wall. Edelgard rolled onto her side, spitting out globs of blood and vomit. She could hear Meissen's frustrated chastisement in the background as Thales merely watched impassively. Bias approached her a few seconds later, examining her and casting a rudimentary heal spell. Ilan, can you pick her up? Edelgard heard him ask as she began to slip into darkness once again. Get her to Miles. As she plunged back into darkness, the only thing that crossed her mind was that Hubert was dead. Edelgard woke up on a cold metal table, wearing nothing but an ankle-length hospital robe with no sleeves. Her wrists and ankles, while no longer bleeding, were chained tightly to each corner of the table. Above her was a harsh white light from a circle of white metal overhead, bearing down on her. At least the headgear was gone. Hubert is dead. It was both different yet identical to the dungeon they'd kept her in when they tried their augmentation on first Valerie, then the others. It was grey-walled and coolly impersonal, with medical saws and knives and needles sitting waiting in neat rows on steel trays. Hubert is dead. The room was empty aside from someone moving things on a shelf behind her head. She couldn't hear any talking beyond the closed doors of the room. Hubert is dead. She tried to reach for her crest power again, to break out of the chains, but her muscles were sluggish and incredibly lethargic, her magic like a muddy river, ragged and unresponsive. Hubert is dead. Abruptly, apropos to nothing, she thought about Justine and the woman who had taken her out of the castle. Where was she now? Had she been able to hide from the Agarthans as they left in Bear to burn? Was she still alive, brought into the Crusader army, or had she been executed to keep her loyalists from having a figurehead to rally around in her absence? Hubert is dead. My father is dead. You woke up. A childish yet somber and tired voice asked. A young figure wandered around to the right side of her slab. He was no older than Lysithea at worst, but his eyes, she saw that look in her father's face while he helplessly watched the disintegration of his children. Huh. You really do look like Anselma. Funny how that works, he mused. From what I've heard you are much more like your old man. You know, my mother's name. Edelgard swallowed reflexively. When had her mother gotten involved with Agartha? Her uncle had begun to behave strangely the day they were informed they could safely return to Adrestia. Safely? Ha! I was apprenticed under Diada, the woman you knew as Cornelia, the boy said with a shrug. He was dressed in the strange clothes of Agarthan civilians, a dark long cloak over a shirt with shortened sleeves and long pants made of a strange dark blue felt. She was subverting the Northern King's Council, one of which was Anselma thanks to her marriage to him. What I remember the most about her was kind to me, despite her sporadic bouts of despair, and championed the girl that Diada was experimenting on who, I couldn't help. I liked her. He walked over to one of the trays and began carefully rolling various syringes over with his fingers. She deserved better. What happened to her? Thales never told me. She'd never seen her mother again after she returned to the Empire. Her memory of her time in the kingdom was incredibly foggy, something she'd never paid much mind to due to the need to focus on the here and now. What use was the past to her, she'd asked herself. Now she just felt foolish for not asking more questions. The boy glanced back at her for a second, shook his head and returned his attention to the task. "You don't want to know," he said with a tired sort of matter-of-fact way. "I do," she bit out, wheezing from her attempt to shout. Her throat was absolutely raw and burned with pain when she swallowed. The boy paused, the bulky silver needle he'd lifted from the tray hovering a few inches above it. Then he sighed heavily. She was happily married to the king, and doted on his son. She was loyal to him, content in his company except for your absence, which pained her. It posed a problem for us, since there were plans in motion at the time in hopes of dropping the kingdom into anarchy. Diado knew that she was missing you, and used that to subvert her. He walked back to her side, placing one hand on her shoulder and brandishing the needle. "This is a painkiller. It's most effective when it's been in your system for a few nights." She tried to recoil from him nonetheless, but the chains gave her no range of movement. "Try not to move. There's no point." There was a faint note of bitterness in his voice as he pressed the needle into her and injected the medical poison within. "I was with Anselma as Diado slowly convinced her that the king was obstructing her from seeing you again out of fear of losing her back to the harem. Course, I knew because of it that the king was just trying to honor his promise to her that you'd be protected. But Diado wore her down and proposed something, that Anselma smuggle a large number of our troops to this conference the king was planning with a foreign country, so they could cause a ruckus at the event that she could use to slip away and find you again. Just a ruckus, nothing more." He shrugged, then glanced off into the corner. Edelgard followed his eyes to see what looked like a horn in the corner of the room, a bright red light emitting from a small circle beneath the horn's mouth. The boy must have known what it was. He tilted his head down and frowned, collecting his thoughts. She must have thought that her friendship with Diado meant her husband and his son would be spared. When the massacre started, she sort of lost her mind when she saw his head get cut off. She kept screaming, running back into the fire again and again to get to her stepson, but the soldiers hauled her off into the carriage. We didn't get far down the road when she just threw the door open, hurled herself out and fled into the forest. Cornelia. A massacre. A northern king beheaded. Edelgard's mind had all the individual pieces, but refused to put the whole picture together. Her heart was trying to tear its way out of her chest, contorting in ways that defied description as she tried to process everything that the boy was telling her. "I eventually found her at the foot of a hill. She must have fallen in her hysterics, because she'd died of internal bleeding." The boy paused at her side, looking down at her with set and tired gray eyes. "I'm sorry." He moved like a ghost, drifting back to the counter beyond the trays. Climbing up onto it with long practice, he opened the cabinets above it and began shifting bottles of various colors within. "What, step-brother?" "I have no step-siblings, only dead ones." She bit out, because the alternative to being angry and stern was. The boy turned toward her. Even in the low light, she saw him giving her a strange look. "Yes you do. You tried to assassinate him several times. You called him the Medboy King." He returned to his work without waiting for a reaction, which was just as well because she was beyond words. "Where do you think you got that ornate silver Faerghus-style dagger from? Some would-be suitor." Her step-brother, Dimitri? Her head ached terribly all of a sudden, like a caged creature was trying to bash its way free. It was wrong and yet it sounded right. She knew that there had been a boy that she'd trusted wholeheartedly, who had valued and adored her, but he was a fragment of the past she'd cast aside along with the rest to save Fodlan. She couldn't even remember his name, so how much could she have mattered to him? "My job is to prep you for your transfiguration," the boy said with the sort of dry calm that was as frightening as it was unemotional. Having found what he was searching for with a relieved sigh, he hopped down from the counter and grabbed one of the bulky needles, pressing it through the lid to fill it. "Ilan expects you to be ready for deployment at a moment's notice. I'm going to put you under for most of it. There is a sedative that won't react poorly to the magic suppressants swimming in your veins." Edelgard tried to pull at the cuffs and chains again, but it was useless. "Hubert is dead. My country has fallen. I can't even defend myself from a boy who looks like he'd rather be anywhere else. They always had the elites. They always had them to counter me and my army. A memory flickered, Justine and her strange tablet, holding it up with entreating eyes. He wants this war. Please don't do this. Everything I did to save Adrestia. Save Fodlan. Everything you did destroyed your home. The boy said bluntly. There are hundreds of people in here we took from your lands in the name of saving Shamhala. I can show you camera view of all of them, the kids and the elderly. Have any of them been saved by what you did? He snorted, then shook his head and lowered his voice. Sorry. Just every time I listen to you talk, I think of how much you sound like Thales. I'm nothing. Edelgard started, anger and repudiation on her tongue. Only suddenly, the words she'd spoken so many times were lost to her. The transformation into demonic beast was no salvation. She knew that long before she saw her brothers and sisters hideously warped into dragons. It would save the others, but what about those people who were strapped to beds just like this, forcibly warped into monsters in the name of salvation to her country's glory? She suddenly remembered the exact moment her disgust at Hevering's tribute went from anger at her people being hurt to anger at him providing extra power to the Agarthans at her expense. She recalled how the massacre at Remire became an insurmountable obstacle to recruiting Byleth first and a tragedy inflicted on the innocent second. She thought of Dorothea standing up for her morals against an emperor forcing war on her and how she blamed the church for poisoning her friend against her. She thought about the people begging, demanding the truth about what happened to their families and the farmers pleading to be allowed to return to their fields before they went fallow, only for her disgust at their disloyalty to take prescience over any other response. She pinpointed the exact moment she began mentally deriding Dmitri for valuing life, sneering at him for being enraged by her alliance with Agartha, the monsters down in the dark who slaughtered his father and people, as him lacking understanding of the choices emperors made. She remembers mocking him as having some appalling obsessive hatred of her born out of a sick mind. She thinks of how she referred to Claude as a half-blood the same way Thales called her a beast, thinking him too unqualified to change Fodlan on account of his Eastern father not having access to Fodlan's true history. Was it true? Was it, the story that the Hresvelgs kept to themselves for a millennia that painted themselves as wronged victims for only having power over half the continent instead of all of it? Hadn't she laughed to herself as she listened to petty nobles trying to assert authority over bits of land with some atrophied family genealogy? She thinks about using the javelins of light to attempt to secure a victory, disregarding her soldiers within the fortress the same way the Seven disregarded her siblings. She thinks about keeping her civilians within the walls of Inver as the army approached, planning on Dmitri, Claude, and Byleth making themselves vulnerable so they and their armies could be taken out. She thinks about forcing the war on and on when her people began protesting in the face of steady losses. How was she saving Fodlan when she discarded their people with the same self-righteous certainty that she'd loathed in the most poisonous of her nobles, whom she'd planned to slowly strip of power? A scream built up in her throat, one that was silenced when the boy gave her another injection and darkness claimed her once again. Check the description for the links to the author.